Yo, what's up everyone? It's Fiction Blue, and today we're checking out Harry used accidental Parseltongue at age 4 to command every snake in Britain to deliver evidence to the ministry. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The night Britain moved. The dream always started the same way. Green light. A sound like the world cracking down the middle. Then warmth, not comfortable warmth, not the kind that meant blankets or sunlight, but the warmth of something ending, something enormous and final, passing through the air just above his head and then gone, like a door slamming shut in a house that had burned to the ground. Harry woke up. He was 4 years old, and he was in the cupboard under the stairs, and it was the middle of the night in the middle of October, and the dark was the particular thick kind that meant it was nowhere close to morning. He lay very still, the way he'd learned to lie still, cataloguing the sounds of the house above and around him, Uncle Vernon's snoring, which came down through the ceiling like distant thunder, Dudley's occasional sleep mumbling from the bedroom that had once been 2 bedrooms until Dudley needed more space for his toys. Harry had a cot, a thin blanket, and a broken torch that he'd found in the bin and fixed himself without understanding how he'd fixed it. He knew not to use the torch when anyone was awake. He turned it on now and looked at the underside of the staircase inches above his face. There were water stains up there that looked like a map of somewhere. He'd been studying that map for as long as he could remember, tracing the routes of the brown watermarks with his eyes, imagining the places they might lead. His scar hurt. It didn't always hurt. Just sometimes, in the dreams. Just sometimes when he remembered the green light, which wasn't really remembering because he'd been barely 1 year old and people didn't remember things from when they were 1 year old. Aunt Petunia said so. She said it when he'd first asked about the scar, the V-shaped mark on his forehead that Dudley called freaky, her voice clipped and final the way it got when she wanted something to be the last word on a subject. You don't remember anything from when you were 1. Nobody does. Don't be dramatic. But Harry remembered the green light. He lay in the dark listening to the house breathe and thought about the dream. There had been something new in it tonight. After the light, after the warmth, after the part that was just his now, worn smooth by repetition, there had been grass. Long grass, wet with night dew, and something moving through it. Something low and swift and purposeful. Not frightening. Harry had never been frightened by snakes. Dudley was. Dudley screamed at them at the zoo and at pictures of them in books. But Harry had always found them quietly sensible creatures, which was an odd thing for a 4-year-old to think, but Harry was, by most measures, an odd 4-year-old. In the dream, the grass had been full of them. Moving in one direction, patient and certain, like a river running towards something it already knew was there. Harry fell back asleep. He didn't know that he was talking in his sleep. He never did. He didn't know that the sounds coming out of his mouth weren't quite English, weren't quite any language a person in Little Whinging would have recognized, were in fact something much older and stranger than anything taught in any school in Britain. He didn't know that the walls of the cupboard were thin and the garden outside the kitchen window had 3 adders in the rockery, and that all 3 of them had gone very still when the sound started, their scales catching the cold moonlight, their entire small bodies oriented toward the house with an attention that was almost reverent. He didn't know any of that. He was 4, and he went back to sleep, and he dreamed about grass. In the Ministry of Magic, the last Tuesday in October was supposed to be quiet. The atrium was always quiet at 3 in the morning. The golden statues of the Fountain of Magical Brethren stood in their eternal arrangement, witch, wizard, centaur, goblin, house elf, all facing inward with expressions of peaceable harmony that nobody who worked in the building took seriously. The fireplaces along the walls were dark and cold. The golden gates to the lifts were shut. The welcome witch's desk was empty, her quill dormant in its inkwell. The only person on duty was a security wizard named Robert Meadows, who had been with the ministry for 22 years and had never once had a noteworthy night shift. He sat at his post near the visitor entrance, the red phone box at street level, the magical delivery shaft from below, and ate a ham sandwich and read the Quidditch scores from the morning's Prophet and was, by any reasonable measure, completely unprepared for what was about to happen to his career. The first one came through the delivery shaft. Meadows heard the thump. He set down his sandwich. Things came through the delivery shaft sometimes: lost post, the occasional misrouted magical parcel, once an extremely confused cat. He went to check with the mild incuriosity of a man who had checked the delivery shaft 4,000 times and found nothing of consequence. There was a snake in the bottom of the shaft. A small one, a common European adder, reddish-brown with the distinctive zigzag marking down its spine, about 2 feet long. It looked up at him with bright amber eyes. Then it moved past him with an air of complete purposefulness, heading toward the center of the atrium. Meadows blinked. The second one came through while he was still looking at the first. Then 2 more. Then a 5th, a 6th. They were coming through the delivery shaft in a steady, unhurried stream, and simultaneously, Meadows realized with a jolt, from the fireplaces. Not through the flue, exactly, but through the grates, through the gaps at the floor level, sinuously, one after another, as though the fireplaces were simply doors they'd chosen to use. And from somewhere above, through a ventilation shaft, he would later determine, though he could never quite explain how they'd navigated it, 3 more descended from the ceiling in a gentle braid. By the time Meadows found his voice, there were 40 snakes in the atrium. He hit the emergency alarm with the flat of his hand and backed away from his desk and said, with admirable composure, "Oh, that is absolutely not right," to no one in particular. By the time the alarm brought the overnight emergency response, 3 Aurors, a maintenance crew supervisor, and a very confused unspeakable who had been working late and came out of the Department of Mysteries with ink on her fingers and an expression of deep professional concern, there were 300. Amelia Bones got the call at 3:47 in the morning. She was already awake. She was usually already awake at 3:47 in the morning, because the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had no business sleeping soundly when the world was the way it was, and Amelia Bones had never been the kind of woman who fooled herself about the state of the world. She was 51 years old, built like someone who had been tested and not found wanting, with iron-gray hair that she wore severely and a monocle that she'd been wearing so long it had become invisible to people who knew her. They stopped seeing it entirely and simply accepted that Amelia Bones looked at you with a particular quality of attention that made you feel like a document being reviewed for inconsistencies. The Patroness arrived through her bedroom window, a small silvery mongoose, which was the form Edgar Tipton's Patronus took, and Edgar Tipton was the senior Auror on the overnight duty, which meant he was either alarmed or dead, and the fact that his Patronus was coherent suggested alarmed. It said, in Edgar's voice with Edgar's specific intonation of barely controlled professional crisis, "Director Bones. Ministry Atrium. You need to come now. And, bring someone from magical creatures. And possibly the prophet. Actually don't bring the prophet." Amelia was out of bed, dressed, and through the flue in 4 minutes. She stepped out into the atrium and stopped. She had been working in the ministry for 26 years. She had seen the atrium after Death Eater attacks and after celebrations that had gotten out of hand and after the catastrophic incident of 1987 that they still referred to in official documents only as the incident with the nesting flobberworms, and she had never seen anything like this. The floor was moving. Not all of it. The marble was still marble. But it was covered, from the base of the fountain to the far wall, in an undulating carpet of serpents. Every size, every British native species, adders, smooth snakes, grass snakes, and also, she noted with additional discomfort, an assortment of what were clearly escaped or released exotic specimens, corn snakes and king snakes and at least 2 boa constrictors of impressive size. They were not aggressive. They were not striking at anyone. They were arranged, or had arranged themselves, in clusters around certain points on the floor, and they were still in the way snakes were still when they had arrived somewhere and were waiting for acknowledgement. Edgar Tipton appeared at her elbow. He was a steady, intelligent man of 38 who had once talked down a rogue manticore and had the scars to prove it, and he currently looked like he needed to sit down. "How many?" Amelia asked. "We counted 412 when we gave up counting," he said. "More came in while we were doing it. We think the total is somewhere around 600 now, but they keep moving, so it's, he made a gesture that encompassed the inadequacy of all known counting methods. Where are they coming from? Everywhere, Director. Everywhere in Britain, near as we can tell. The ones with markings on their scales, the exotics, came from pet shops, zoos, private collectors. The wild ones came from, he paused. From the countryside. From people's gardens. We've had 4 reports already from Muggle Emergency Services, through the monitoring office, about unexplained mass serpent movement in rural areas. Surrey. Hampshire. Wiltshire. The Cotswolds. Amelia looked at the snakes. The snakes, or some of them, looked back. There was something in the quality of their stillness that she recognized after a moment as patience. Not the patience of creatures waiting for an opportunity. The patience of creatures that had come a long way to deliver something. They've brought things, she said. Not a question. She'd already noticed. Yes, Edgar said. He walked her to the nearest cluster, a dozen adders coiled around a point near the east wall. On the floor at the center of the cluster were objects. A scrap of parchment, torn, the ink Muggle blue biro. 2 photographs, Muggle, not moving. What appeared to be a child's sock. A broken piece of a child's crayon, red, and a sealed letter, addressed in a hand that Amelia recognized with a jolt as Albus Dumbledore's. That letter, she said. Yes. We found 11 of his letters in total. Same handwriting. Several of them opened. Edgar hesitated. They weren't the only ones. There seem to be letters from several ministry officials, Director. And from other people. Some of them are sealed. Some of them have already been opened, presumably by the original recipients. We don't know how the snakes got them. Amelia crouched down. She was aware that 600 snakes were watching her, and she stared at the nearest adder with the same quality of attention it was directing at her, and she said, steadily, "You came here for a reason." The adder moved. Not aggressively, not randomly. It moved to the letter with Dumbledore's handwriting and pressed the flat of its head against it, once, firmly, and then looked at her. Amelia stood up. She looked at Edgar. "I want an emergency session of the Wisengamot," she said. "I want every piece of evidence these animals have brought catalogued and logged before sunrise, with full chain of custody documentation. I want a Parseltongue translator on the floor to me within the hour." Edgar stared at her. "It's 4 a.m. "Yes," said Amelia. "And there are 600 snakes in my ministry. Wake everyone up." She walked to the center of the atrium, surrounded by silent, patient serpents, and took out her notebook, and began. In a modest house in Edinburgh, a Hogwarts professor named Aurora Sinistra was woken by the urgent rattling of her flu and spent 20 minutes arguing with the ministry's overnight communications officer about whether she was, in fact, the closest registered Parseltongue translator to London before accepting that apparently she was and that apparently she needed to go right now. She arrived in the atrium at 4:20 with her reading glasses on her head and an expression of thorough professional readiness that was only slightly undermined by the fact that she was still in her dressing gown. She stood at the edge of the great serpent gathering and said nothing for a long moment. Amelia watched her. Then Sinistra knelt on the floor. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was, wrong, in the way beautiful things were sometimes wrong, liquid and consonantless and layered in a way human mouths weren't supposed to produce. The snakes reacted immediately. Not by moving but by a collective change in the quality of their stillness, like an audience settling when the overture begins. "They're waiting to give testimony," Sinistra said. Her voice was steady but her eyes were wide. They say they were called." "Called by whom?" Sinistra listened. Her face changed. "They don't have a name for it. They describe it as," she listened again, her head tilted. "A sleeping child. A speaker. They describe the call as being in the old tongue, a formal summons command, the kind that senior parcelmasters used to use. The kind that hasn't been heard in Britain for, she looked up at Amelia. Decades. Possibly longer. A child, Amelia said. That's what they say. How old a child? Sinistra spoke again. Listened. Very young. Very small. They describe his scent, they don't see the way we do, Director, they navigate partly by scent and heat, they describe his scent as that of a child who is not well fed and who sleeps in a space without windows. She paused. They describe it with some feeling. The atrium was quiet except for the soft sound of scales on marble. Amelia looked around at 600 snakes from all across Britain, who had left their dens and shops and gardens and zoos and made their way to this place in the middle of the night because a child spoke in his sleep, and she felt something cold and clear settle into her chest, the particular sensation she had learned over 26 years to recognize as the feeling of a case that was going to matter. The evidence they brought, she said. What is it? Sinistra turned back to the snakes and spoke at length this time, a long slow exchange that Amelia watched without understanding a word of it, reading it instead in the shift of Sinistra's expression, from professional attentiveness, to interest, to something that tightened her jaw and made her press her lips together. The letters, Sinistra said finally. They found the letters in homes where they lived, garden adders, hearth snakes, the kind that spend years in a single house listening. They've been listening. Some of these snakes have been in the same household for decades. The ones from pet shops were passed between homes and shops and she stopped. Director, they have testimony. Not physical evidence, not documents. Testimony. Eyewitness accounts, in the serpent sense. They saw things. They heard things. The letters were brought to corroborate what they witnessed. What did they witness? A pause. Sinistra was listening to something long, something delivered with the careful precision of a creature that had been waiting a long time to be heard. A child, Sinistra said at last. Her voice was quiet now, the professional steadiness working harder. A child placed in the care of Muggle relatives after the deaths of his parents. A child with a scar on his forehead and his father's eyes. A child who was not being well cared for. She looked up, and through the reading glasses that were still on her head like a forgotten crown, her eyes were very direct. They are detailed accounts, Director. They saw things that, if even a third of them are accurate, how many snakes have testimony to give? Amelia asked. Sinistra asked. Listened. All of them. All 600 of them. Amelia Bones stood in the center of the ministry atrium at 4:30 in the morning, surrounded by Britain's snakes, and understood with the clear cold precision that defined her thinking that this had already become the most significant case of her career. She turned to Edgar Tipton, who had been standing behind her with his dictoquill running and the look of a man who was quietly reconstructing his retirement plans. I want Dumbledore's letters opened and documented, she said. I want a child welfare specialist from the Department of Magical Guardianship here within 2 hours. I want a full address on every location these animals came from. She paused. And I want someone to find me the address of whatever household in Surrey smells like a child who isn't being fed. It was just past 5 in the morning when the last of the snakes arrived. This one was different. The others had moved in groups, in quiet streams. This one came alone, through the main visitor entrance, through the telephone box, which it had apparently activated by wrapping itself around the receiver, because someone would later find the distinctive scale pattern imprinted on the plastic, and it moved through the atrium with the unhurried authority of something that did not need to hurry because it had been moving toward this moment for longer than most of the people in the room had been alive. It was an adder, but ancient. They could see it in the density of the markings, the weight of the scales, the particular deliberateness of movement that came with extreme age. It was perhaps 4 feet long, which was large for its species, and the zigzag pattern on its spine was so dark it was almost black. It moved through the other snakes, which parted for it with an unmistakable deference, and came to the center of the atrium, directly beneath the central ceiling light, and coiled there. It had brought something. It had been carrying it the entire way from wherever it had come from, held carefully in the slight fold behind its jaw, not swallowed, not dragged, but carried, with the care of something precious. It set it down in the center of its coil and looked at Amelia Bones with eyes that were amber going on gold, ancient and patient and entirely without fear. Amelia stepped forward. She crouched down and looked at what the old snake had brought. It was a piece of parchment, and it was old, and it was sealed with a ministry seal, the official seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it was addressed to, the Office of the Minister of Magic, Re, Child Placement Order, Potter, H.J., dated November 1, 1981. It had never been opened. Behind her, she heard Edgar Tipton make a sound that wasn't quite a word. She heard Sinistra speak to the ancient adder, a quiet exchange, and the adder's response which Sinistra translated with the careful precision of someone not trusting themselves to editorialize. It was in a garden in Godric's Hollow, Sinistra said. It has lived there for 30 years. It was there on the night of October 31, 1981. It saw, she stopped. It says it saw everything. Amelia looked at the sealed letter in the center of the ancient snake's coil, at the ministry seal that had never been broken, at the date, November 1, 1981, the day after James and Lily Potter died, and she understood that she was looking at the document that should have started a process that had never been started. A process that would have ensured a child had a proper guardian, proper oversight, proper care. A process that had been bypassed. She stood up. She looked around the atrium, at all 600 of Britain's snakes arranged around her in quiet witness. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the ceiling's enchanted sky. It was still dark outside, still the deep blue of pre-dawn, but the enchanted ceiling was beginning its slow movement toward morning. The snakes were lit by it, their scales catching the first imitation of dawn. "I'm going to need a bigger conference room," she said. At Privet Drive, Harry woke up for the second time at 7:30 when Aunt Petunia's footsteps passed his cupboard on her way to the kitchen. He listened to the pattern of the household starting, kettle, radio 2, Dudley's thunderous descent for breakfast, Uncle Vernon's cough and grumble sequence from upstairs. He lay on his cot and looked at the water-stained map on the underside of the stairs and thought about the dream. The grass and the snakes. The purposeful, patient movement toward something they already knew was waiting. He had a strange feeling, not bad strange, not the tight frightened strange of when Uncle Vernon's voice went a particular shade of loud, but something lighter. Something that felt, if Harry had had the vocabulary for it at 4 years old, a bit like relief. Like the feeling of setting something down that you'd been carrying a long way. He didn't know why he felt it. He didn't know what he'd done in his sleep. He just lay there in his cupboard while the household started its day around him, and the relief sat in his chest like a warm stone, and outside in the rockery the 3 adders who had heard him first were already gone, already miles away, headed south, carrying what they knew. The morning light came through the thin crack under the cupboard door, and Harry thought about the map on the ceiling above him, and all the places it might lead. Aunt Petunia's footsteps returned. They stopped at the cupboard door. "Boy," she said. "Breakfast." Harry folded his blanket with the precision of someone who had very little space and had learned to manage it carefully. He straightened his oversized shirt, the hand-me-down Dudley one that hung off his shoulders and fell past his knees. He opened the cupboard door and stepped out into the hallway and blinked in the morning light and looked up at his Aunt Petunia, who was looking down at him with her usual expression, somewhere between distaste and a kind of studied blankness, like someone who had decided not to see a thing too clearly. He was, by any measure, a small child. Too thin, too pale, with eyes that were too large for his face and glasses that were too big for his nose and hair that stuck up in every direction regardless of what was done to it. He had a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt. He was 4 years old. He said, "Good morning, Aunt Petunia," in a voice that was perfectly ordinary, in perfectly ordinary English, and went to set the table for breakfast. He didn't know that at that exact moment, in a conference room 3 floors below the atrium of the Ministry of Magic, Amelia Bones was opening the unsealed letter that had waited 4 years in a dead woman's garden, and that its contents were, word by word, beginning to dismantle the framework of a lie. He didn't know that the world had shifted in the night, that 600 animals had crossed Britain in the dark carrying his cause forward while he slept, that the first morning of the rest of his life had already started without him, out there in the wider world that hadn't known his name until it did. He set out forks and spoons in the right order. He folded napkins the way Aunt Petunia liked them. He stood on his stool to reach the shelf where the orange juice lived. He was 4 years old, and he had changed everything, and he didn't know it yet. But somewhere in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a woman with a monocle and a conscience was reading a letter with the ministry's own seal on it, and her jaw was getting tighter with every line, and her pen was moving faster, and the case that would redefine the wizarding world's understanding of its own failures was already, unstoppably, underway. The kitchen radio played quietly. The kettle finished boiling. Dudley ate 4 pieces of toast and Harry ate 1 and didn't complain, because he'd learned not to complain, because complaining made things worse. He looked at the morning light on the kitchen table and felt the strange warm stone feeling in his chest and didn't know what it meant. Outside, the garden was quiet. The rockery was empty. The snakes were gone, south and east and away, carrying everything they'd witnessed to the only place in Britain that might do something with it. And in the ministry, far below the daily river of wizarding London, 600 serpents waited in patient silence, and Amelia Bones did not stop writing until the sun was fully up. Chapter 2, The Evidence Speaks. The first letter Amelia opened wasn't Dumbledore's. She made that choice deliberately, because she knew if she opened his first, everything after it would be read through that lens, through the long, complicated shadow that Albus Dumbledore cast over every room in the ministry whether he was in it or not. She wanted the case built from the ground up, brick by brick, the way she'd built every case worth building in 26 years. Start with the facts that no one could argue with. Build outward from the center. The unsealed ministry letter from November 1, 1981 was the center. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the conference table with the particular careful precision of someone resisting the urge to throw it through a window, and looked at Edgar Tipton, and said, "This is an official child placement recommendation. From this department. Signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr." Edgar, who had read it over her shoulder, nodded. "It recommends that Harry James Potter be placed in the custody of his godfather, one Sirius Orion Black, pending investigation of the said godfather's circumstances and the confirmation of his fitness as a guardian." She tapped the date. November 1. The day after the Potters died. Yes. This letter was never delivered. No. It was sealed with our own seal and it spent 4 years in a garden in Godric's Hollow. Amelia picked up her pen. "I want to know who intercepted it. I want to know who made the decision that it would be better for this document to not reach the minister's office. And I want to know," she paused, "where Sirius Black actually is." Edgar hesitated, and in that hesitation Amelia read the answer before he gave it. "Azkaban," he said. "He was placed in Azkaban the day after the Potters died. November 2, 1981. Without trial." A longer hesitation. "Edgar." "Without trial," he confirmed. He looked like a man who had just discovered something unpleasant living in his wall. "Director, the file on Black is, it was processed under emergency wartime powers. Under Crouch's department. There are almost no standard procedural documents. The arrest report is 2 pages. Amelia put down her pen. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding between several responses and choosing the one that was professionally appropriate rather than honest. Then she looked back at Edgar. "Pull every document we have on the Black arrest. Pull the placement records for Harry Potter, whatever placement records exist, if any exist beyond this letter. And pull Bartemius Crouch Sr.'s correspondence files for November and December 1981. He's still the department head for, I'm aware of who he is," Amelia said. "Pull them anyway." Edgar left. Amelia turned to the next letter. Aurora Sinistra had been working for 3 hours, moving between snake clusters with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who was deeply uncomfortable with what she was hearing and absolutely committed to hearing all of it. She'd worked with serpent testimony before. It was a niche discipline, the intersection of magizoology and wizarding law, and most prosecutors treated it as supplementary at best, inadmissible at worst. There had been a case in the 70s involving an illegal potions operation that had been partly convicted on snake testimony, and the defense had screamed about it for years afterward. The law on it was genuinely murky. But testimony from a magical serpent, properly witnessed and transcribed by a qualified Parseltongue translator, carried a specific legal weight under the Wizarding Evidence Act of 1943, and Amelia had said document everything, so Sinistra was documenting everything. She was sitting cross-legged on the marble floor of the atrium. Her dressing gown had been replaced at some point by borrowed robes that were slightly too large for her, with a dictoquill running beside her and the ancient adder from Godric's Hollow coiled at a respectful distance, delivering its account with the measured cadence of something that had been waiting 30 years to give it. It took nearly 2 hours for the old snake to finish. When it did, Sinistra sat with the transcription in her hands and read it back and felt the specific quiet horror of a person who had just had a thing she'd suspected confirmed into certainty. She stood up, walked to the conference room, knocked once, and went in without waiting for an answer, because the kind of document she was holding didn't wait for answers. She set the transcription on the table in front of Amelia Bones. "The Godric's Hollow serpent," she said. "I need you to read the 3rd page." Amelia read the 3rd page. The room was very quiet. "It names Peter Pettigrew," Amelia said. "Yes. It claims to have been in the garden of the cottage on the night of October 31, 1981, and to have witnessed, through the kitchen window, whose curtains were partially open, a conversation between Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew at approximately 6 in the evening." Amelia kept reading, her voice becoming slower and more careful with each sentence. "It states that Pettigrew was, visibly afraid. That the conversation was an argument. That Black was attempting to convince Pettigrew to change the secret keeper arrangement, to move the Fidelius charm to Black himself." "Keep reading," Sinistra said. "And that Pettigrew refused." Amelia set the page down. She looked up at Sinistra. "This account, if accurate, is the exact inverse of what Pettigrew told, of what the official record says. The official record has Black as the secret keeper who betrayed the Potters. Black's alleged confession at the scene of Pettigrew's supposed death has him laughing and admitting it. The snake was in the garden," Sinistra said. "It heard Black say, 'I'll give you the direct translation, if you won't let me take it, then hide yourself better, Peter. Hide yourself so well that nothing can find you. Because if you're the one holding this, and something goes wrong, I won't be able to protect you.' Those are not the words of a man who planned to betray his friends." The silence between them had weight to it. "An adder," Amelia said finally, "cannot be confounded, cannot be imperiused, is not susceptible to memory charms, and has no political affiliations." She said it flatly, like a legal argument being built in real time. Its testimony, properly transcribed, is among the cleanest evidence this department can receive. "There are 3 other snakes with partial testimony from that night," Sinistra said. 2 from the surrounding gardens, 1 from inside the house, a small corn snake that had been living in the walls for several months. The accounts are consistent with each other and consistent with the adders." Amelia stood up. She walked to the window. The conference room had a narrow window that looked out onto one of the ministry's internal light shafts, not exactly a view, but a direction to face while thinking, and she stood there for a moment with her hands clasped behind her back. "How is Sirius Black?" she asked. Sinistra blinked at the apparent non sequitur, then understood it wasn't one. "I don't know. I assume badly. He's been in Azkaban for 4 years. Without trial. On the testimony of a dead man, Pettigrew, and a confession extracted at a traumatic scene from a man who had just lost his best friends." She turned around. "And the child he was supposed to be guardian to has been living with Muggle relatives for 4 years in circumstances that 600 snakes apparently found alarming enough to mobilize for." "That's a fairly accurate summary, yes." "Right," Amelia said. She went back to the table and opened the next letter in the pile, which was one of Dumbledore's. She broke the seal with a letter knife and read it with her jaw set and her pen ready. After 2 minutes she made a sound that was low and contained and not quite appropriate to a professional setting. She put it in a separate pile. "That pile," Sinistra said, "is getting bigger." "Yes," said Amelia. "It is." Cornelius Fudge arrived at 9:15, by which point there were 17 ministry officials in the building. The atrium had been cordoned off with a combination of physical barriers and notice-me-not charms to keep the non-essential staff from walking into 600 snakes, and the conference room had developed the organized chaos of a case that had been running all night with no signs of stopping for breakfast. Fudge had been Minister for Magic for 3 years. He was a round, pink-faced man who wore a lime-green bowler hat that nobody had ever successfully convinced him was a mistake, and he had the particular bearing of someone who had risen to a position by being good at not making enemies rather than by being good at the job, which meant he was instinctively, reflexively allergic to anything that looked like a decision. He came in through the flue, looked at the atrium, looked at the snakes, looked at the cordons, and found Amelia Bones, and said with tremendous political instinct, "What is all this, Amelia? The morning papers are going to say whatever they say," Amelia said without looking up from the document she was reading. "Good morning, Minister." "Good morning, Amelia, there are snakes, yes. 647 at last count. They arrived between 3 and 5 this morning from locations across Britain and deposited evidence of serious crimes in the ministry atrium. I have been here since 4:30. I have not slept. Would you like tea? I've had 6 cups and I recommend it." Fudge stared at her. Then he looked at Edgar Tipton, who gave him the expression of a man who had processed this situation and come out the other side of it and had nothing useful to add. Then Fudge looked at the snakes again, as though hoping they'd changed somehow. "Evidence," Fudge said. "Of what sort of crimes?" "Child endangerment. Unlawful detention. Obstruction of justice. Potentially conspiracy to pervert the course of wizarding law." Amelia set down the document and looked at him directly. "And Sirius Black needs a trial." Fudge made a sound. "Minister." "Amelia, he has been in Azkaban for 4 years with no trial. We have physical evidence and magical testimony that directly contradicts the official account of his alleged crimes. The ministry placed that child," she gestured at the file in front of her, "in unlicensed, uninspected Muggle care without following our own protocols, and there is a document with this department's seal on it that was intercepted and never delivered that would have prevented that placement entirely." She paused. "I need emergency Wisengamot oversight on this case and I need it today." Fudge had gone from pink to a more specific shade of red. "You can't just, Amelia, you understand the political dimensions here, the Death Eater trials are still, ongoing." "Yes, I know, I run the department that's prosecuting them." She did not soften her voice. "Minister. I have the testimony of a 400-year-old adder from Godric's Hollow describing Sirius Black as a man who tried to protect his friends, and I have a document confirming he was denied the basic legal right of a trial. Whatever the political dimensions are, they don't change those facts." Fudge looked at the pile of letters. He looked at the transcription stacks. He looked at Amelia Bones, who was looking at him the way she looked at everything, like a document being reviewed for inconsistencies. "I'll need to consult with the legal team," he said. "And perhaps we should speak with Dumbledore. I've sent Dumbledore a summons," Amelia said. "He'll be here at 2 o'clock. Something moved through Fudge's expression: surprise, recalibration, the instinctive reorientation toward the nearest powerful person. "Well. Good. Good, that's, yes. I'm sure Albus will have a perspective on all this." "I'm certain he will," Amelia said, and returned to her document. Fudge lingered for another moment, reading the room and finding nothing that reflected his preferred interpretation of events back at him. Then he left, murmuring something about scheduling a press briefing. Edgar watched him go. "That went well," he said drily. "He'll try to delay it," Amelia said. "He'll want to wait and see which way public opinion is going to land before he commits to anything." By the time public opinion has landed, I'll have enough case documents that delaying will look worse than acting. She turned a page. Bring me the Hogwarts governor's correspondence file. I've just found 3 letters to Dumbledore from various board members who appear to have been asking questions about the Potter boys' placement and received very reassuring non-answers. The Parseltongue sessions continued throughout the morning. Sinistra moved from cluster to cluster in a systematic sweep, taking testimony, translating, transcribing. She had been joined by 2 colleagues from the Hogwarts staff, another Parseltongue speaker, a retired charms professor named Wendell Bright, who had come down from his home in Bath and was managing the smaller snake clusters near the west wall, and a young magizoologist from the ministry's own beast division named Petra Vance, who didn't speak Parseltongue but was cataloguing the physical evidence, the letters, the objects, the photographs, with a methodical thoroughness that Amelia had immediately found indispensable. Petra Vance was 26 years old and had been working in the Beast Division for 2 years because the ministry kept hiring her and assigning her to the wrong department, and she had the specific energy of a very competent person being significantly underused. She laid out the physical evidence on long tables in the secondary conference room with the care of an archaeologist, labeling each item with location, species of carrier, and estimated distance traveled. The photographs were the most striking. They were Muggle photographs, non-moving, and they had come from 3 separate sources, found in gardens, retrieved from near bins, picked up from outside windows. They showed a small, dark-haired boy in outsized clothing at various ages. Some of them were clearly taken by neighbors or passers-by, a small figure in a garden, a child at a school gate, a boy on a bicycle several sizes too large. Others appeared to have been dropped or discarded, blurry snapshots perhaps taken by the Dursleys and then not kept. In all of them, the child was thin. In most of them, he was alone. Petra documented each photograph with the expression of someone keeping her professional composure through an act of will. There were also, more unusually, small objects. A child's crayon, broken. A button. 2 pages torn from what appeared to be a school exercise book, in a child's handwriting, sums, addition and subtraction, all correct, completed in pencil with an erasure here and there where the child had second-guessed themselves and been right the first time. A piece of rope, frayed at both ends, looped into a small circle the diameter of a child's wrist. Petra photographed the rope, documented it, labeled it, and then stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she picked up her quill and wrote, under additional notes, "This item requires immediate examination by the child welfare specialist." The welfare specialist, a witch named Gemma Alcott from the Department of Magical Guardianship, arrived at 11 and went directly to Petra's table and spent 45 minutes with the physical evidence before she came to find Amelia with a file of her own. "The Muggle authorities," she said, standing in the doorway of Amelia's conference room with her arms crossed. "Have there been any welfare visits to the household? Any school records we can access?" "We're working on it," Amelia said. "The rope, I know. Director. That child is at Privet Drive right now." "I know," Amelia said again. Her voice was even, controlled, the voice of a woman who was managing urgency by channeling it into her pen. "I have a welfare visit authorized and a team ready. I am waiting for one more document before I send them, because I want to send them with everything we have rather than enough to be turned away at the door." She looked up. "How long have you been in guardianship?" 12 years. "Then you know that if we go in without a complete legal picture and the Muggles refuse us entry, we lose the element of surprise and the child could be moved, I know." Gemma Alcott uncrossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "What document are you waiting for?" "There's a sealed letter in the atrium. One of the oldest ones. It came from a house in Wiltshire, from a garden snake that's been with the same family for 20 years. The family is, I believe the family is connected to Dumbledore's network. The letter is sealed with a Fidelius-adjacent charm and I need our charm specialist to open it without destroying the contents." "How long?" "He says 20 minutes. That was 15 minutes ago." Gemma nodded. She looked at the pile of documents on the table. Do you know how a child snake testimony case is usually received in the Wiesengemot? She asked. Skeptically, Amelia said. That's generous. The last time anyone tried to bring serpent testimony in a child welfare case, the defense counsel laughed it out of the chamber. The last time, Amelia said, they had 17 snakes and one Parseltongue translator working from notes. I have 647 snakes, 3 translators, and a document with the ministry's own seal on it that confirms we failed this child by our own procedural standards. She picked up her pen. They are welcome to try laughing. Gemma Alcott smiled, which rearranged her whole face. I'll wait in the hall, she said. The sealed letter from the Wiltshire snake was opened at 11:42. It was 4 pages long, dense, written in a precise academic hand that Amelia recognized from the earlier letters as belonging to Albus Dumbledore. Unlike the others, the ones she'd been reading all morning, the carefully worded reassurances and gentle deflections that told various concerned parties that the Potter child was perfectly safe and well placed and that certain precautions had been taken, this letter was different in character. It was written to himself. Not a memo. Not correspondence. A letter in the style of a private note, the kind of thing you wrote when you were working through a decision and needed to see it in writing, because seeing it in writing made it real enough to live with. It was dated November 3, 1981, and it began, I placed the child this morning. Petunia Dursley, née Evans, of 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Lily's sister. The Muggle protections are the strongest available. The blood ward anchored to Petunia makes it functionally impenetrable to any dark magical approach. The boy will be safe. Sirius will object. I am aware of this. I am also aware that Sirius is not in a position to object, given the current circumstances. By the time those circumstances resolve, and they will resolve, I have faith in the justice system I have spent 60 years building, the protections will be established and the ward conditions will be stable. Petunia is not, she has never been a warm woman. Lily knew this. I know this. But warmth is not the primary consideration. Safety is. And if the boy is warm but unprotected, warmth serves nothing. I have not informed the ministry of the specific placement. This is, I acknowledge, procedurally irregular. The recommendation on record calls for placement with Sirius. I cannot in good conscience wait for that recommendation to be processed, investigated, and approved while the boy remains unprotected, while the remnants of Voldemort's supporters are still active, while the situation is still volatile. I am making a decision on behalf of a child who cannot make decisions for himself. I believe it is the right decision. I believe Lily would understand. I am less certain she would forgive it. The letter continued for 3 more pages, working through the reasoning with the thoroughness of a brilliant mind that was also, on this particular question, not quite willing to look at itself directly. It acknowledged the irregularity. It used words like necessary and temporary and revisit. It did not, Amelia noted, use the word sorry. She read it 3 times. She put it in the pile she'd designated in her mind, even before she'd made a formal pile, as Dumbledore. It was the largest pile. Then she stood up, straightened her robes, and went to find Gemma Alcott. We're going to Privet Drive, she said. The Parseltongue translations were still coming in at noon, and Wendell Bright had started filing his transcriptions in a separate system from Sinistra's because the volume was becoming unmanageable, and Petra Vance had taken over a 3rd room for the overflow physical evidence, and the ministry atrium still contained 647 snakes who were not showing any particular interest in leaving. The oldest adder had not moved from its coil beneath the central light. Sinistra came to sit near it during her lunch break. She'd been brought a sandwich by a thoughtful junior clerk who was clearly the most practically intelligent person in the building, and looked at it for a while. It regarded her with patient gold eyes. You've been here the longest, she said to it, in Parseltongue. It acknowledged this. You'll wait until someone acts. We will wait until the speaker is safe, it said. And the word it used for speaker, Sinistra had been translating Parseltongue for 30 years, had compiled 2 reference grammars and a dictionary of archaic serpent idiom, was not the standard word, not the word for a Parselmouth, a human who happened to speak the snake language. It was the old word, the formal word, the word that in older texts referred to the one who had the right to call, the true tongue. The one who spoke not because they had learned it but because they were born into it. Sinistra wrote it down. She looked at what she'd written, at the designation that meant something very specific in the historical literature, and thought about what it meant that a 4-year-old had used it in his sleep, and what it meant for the battle everyone thought was over. She finished her sandwich. She went back to work. Outside, London was going about its Tuesday, completely unaware that in the building beneath the phone box in a side street near Whitehall, a small revolution was in its 3rd hour of documentation. The city moved around it, indifferent and enormous. Inside, the snakes waited. Amelia Bones pulled on her outer robes and straightened her monocle and walked through the atrium toward the exit, and every snake she passed oriented toward her as she passed, a long ripple of attention following her from the fountain of magical brethren to the visitor entrance, like a slow wave, like a crowd watching someone they'd been expecting. She stopped at the ancient adder's coil. Looked down at it. "I'm going to him now," she said, not knowing it spoke no English, finding herself speaking anyway the way people spoke to things that seemed to be listening. The ancient adder regarded her. Then it did something Sinistra would have called extraordinary, it moved its head once, a slow deliberate motion. Down, and up. A nod, of sorts. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, nodded back. Then she walked out into London and Opera to Surrey, with a file of documents under her arm and the expression of a woman going somewhere to begin the process of setting several things right. Behind her, in the ministry atrium, 647 snakes settled into their patient waiting and the day continued around them, and somewhere in a quiet suburban house a 4-year-old boy was eating lunch in a kitchen where nobody was talking to him, not knowing that his world was about to crack open like an egg, not knowing that something enormous was already on its way to him. Not knowing that the night before he had called the whole country to his defense without even waking up. He sat at the kitchen table with his single sandwich, white bread, the end piece, nothing on it except margarine, and looked out the window at the garden where the rockery was empty of snakes, and felt, still, that warm stone feeling in his chest. He didn't know what it meant. He would find out soon enough. Chapter 3, Number 4, Privet Drive looked exactly like every other street in Little Whinging, which was the point of it. The houses were identical in the way that things became identical when someone had decided sameness was a virtue, the same cream-colored rendering, the same neat front gardens with the same species of hedge trimmed to the same height, the same double-glazed windows catching the October afternoon light with the same mild suburban glitter. The cars in the driveways were variations on a theme. The curtains were variations on a theme. Even the welcome mat seemed to be in quiet competition for the most inoffensive possible design. Amelia Bones had grown up in a farmhouse in Yorkshire with draughts in every room and an orchard that hadn't been properly managed in 40 years, and she had a complicated feeling about streets like this. She stood at the top of it and looked down its careful length and thought that it was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen, which made it the perfect place to hide something. Gemma Alcott stood beside her, holding her own case file and the expression of someone who had visited houses like this before in a professional capacity and never found it easy. Behind them, at a respectful distance that was also a legally careful one, stood 2 aurors from Amelia's department, not Edgar, who was managing the atrium situation, but 2 she trusted, a sharp-faced woman named Delphine Yates and a stocky, quiet man named Thomas Okafor who had been in the department for 15 years and had a gift for standing in a room without escalating it. They had taken a muggle taxi from 2 streets over. Arriving by apparition on Privet Drive itself seemed inadvisable for a variety of reasons, and the driver had given them the particular look that London taxi drivers reserved for fares who were clearly from somewhere else without being visibly foreign, the look that said something about you is off but I can't quite say what. Number 4, Amelia said. Yes, said Gemma. They walked down the street. A curtain moved in the house opposite, Number 4's immediate neighbor. A woman appeared briefly in a window 2 doors down. The street observed them with the intense, barely disguised attention of a place where new things were noted and discussed. Amelia knocked on the door of number 4, Privet Drive. She knocked 3 times, firmly, the way she knocked on every door she'd ever knocked on in a professional capacity, which was to say, the way that communicated without aggression that the person behind it was going to open it. The door opened. Vernon Dursley was a large man, and Amelia was a small woman, and he used the difference in their sizes the way certain men used it, standing in the doorway so that his width filled it, looking down at her with the specific expression of a man who had decided that whoever was on his doorstep was a problem that would go away if he was sufficiently unpleasant. He had a thick neck and small eyes and the look of someone who considered himself, on the whole, a very reasonable person who was being unreasonably bothered. "Yes," he said. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia said. "My name is Amelia Bones. I'm from the ministry." She did not specify which ministry. She had found over the years that most people filled the word in with whatever ministry they were most afraid of. "I'd like to come in." "What's this about?" "It's about your nephew, Mr. Dursley." Something moved across his face. It was quick, well practiced, the same motion every time, she suspected. A kind of settling. A door closing behind his eyes. "Our nephew is perfectly fine," he said. "Whatever you've heard, I haven't heard anything, Mr. Dursley. I've read quite a lot. May I come in?" He didn't move. "I don't know what this is about, but we've done nothing wrong. We took that boy in out of the goodness of our, Mr. Dursley." Amelia's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It just became very specific, the way a scalpel was specific. "I have 2 colleagues with me. We can have this conversation in your sitting room, or we can have it in a rather more formal setting. One of those options is significantly more comfortable for your family than the other. I'm quite happy either way." Vernon Dursley looked at her. He looked at Gemma Alcott. He looked at Yates and Okafor, standing at the garden gate with the patient stillness of people who did this for a living. He looked back at Amelia. He stepped back from the door. The sitting room of number 4 was aggressively tidy. That was the first thing Amelia noticed, not the tidiness itself, but the aggression of it, the way every surface was controlled and positioned and free of anything that wasn't meant to be there. The photographs on the mantel were all of a broad blonde boy at various stages of growth, birthday parties, holidays, a particularly ambitious school portrait in which he was attempting gravity. There were no photographs of a dark-haired child. There was no evidence in this room that a dark-haired child lived here at all. Petunia Dursley was standing by the window when they came in. She was a thin woman, angular in the way of someone who had decided precision was safer than softness, with a neck that was slightly too long and eyes that moved very quickly when they thought you weren't looking. She was looking at Amelia with an expression that Amelia had seen before on the faces of people who had been dreading a specific knock on a specific door for a specific number of years. She knows why we're here, Amelia thought. She has always known this day was possible. Mrs. Dursley, Amelia said pleasantly. Thank you for having us. I'll put the kettle on, Petunia said. She left the room. Her footsteps were very quick on the kitchen tile. Vernon remained standing. Sit down if you like, he said, in the tone of someone who hoped they wouldn't. Amelia sat. Gemma sat beside her. Yates remained near the door, not aggressively, just there. Okafor stayed in the hallway, which was where they'd agreed he'd stay, near the cupboard under the stairs, from which they could hear, faintly, the sound of movement. A small movement. A child adjusting position. Amelia kept her expression neutral. She opened her case file on her knee. Where is Harry? She asked. In his room, Vernon said. I see. And where is his room? A pause. Not a long one, he was good at this, she had to give him that, he'd had 4 years of practice. Upstairs, he said. She looked down at her file. She had chosen, specifically, which documents to bring to this first visit. Not all of them, not yet. Just enough. She took out the first one, which was Petra Vance's documented catalogue of the physical evidence with the photographs attached, and placed it on the coffee table between them. Vernon looked at it. He didn't touch it. Those photographs, Amelia said, were retrieved this morning from locations near this property. Gardens, mostly. A few from near the school gate down the road, I believe. She looked at him evenly. The child in them appears underweight for his age, across all photographs. The clothing is, significantly oversized. The Muggle welfare standard for a child of this age, in terms of physical presentation, he's a perfectly healthy boy, Vernon said. His voice had gone to a particular register, one she recognized, controlled indignation, the voice of a man who had decided offense was the best defense. He eats the same as any child. He's just small. Always has been. He's 4 years old and he appears to weigh significantly less than the 50th percentile for his age group, Gemma Alcott said. This was the first time she'd spoken. She had a straightforward, unhurried voice, and she directed it at Vernon with the even warmth of a person who was very professionally unimpressed. That can indicate any number of things. We'd like to have him seen by a healer today. A what? A doctor, Amelia said smoothly. There's nothing wrong with him that requires. The kitchen door opened. Petunia came in with a tea tray, moving with the precise efficiency of someone occupying themselves with a task because standing still wasn't possible. She set the tray down, and as she straightened up she looked at the photographs on the coffee table, and for just a moment, a very small moment, the length of a breath, her face did something that wasn't the blank careful expression she'd been wearing. It collapsed, briefly, into something older and more honest. Then it reassembled. Tea, she said. Nobody answered. Amelia looked at Petunia. Petunia looked at the wall above Amelia's head. Vernon was looking at Amelia like a man working out a problem. I'd like to see Harry, Amelia said. I told you, I know what you told me, Mr. Dursley. She stood up, which had the effect of changing the geometry of the room. She was considerably shorter than him but she occupied space in a way that didn't care about height. I have documentation here from our department that raises several significant concerns about this household. I have the legal authority to inspect the living conditions of any child under ministry guardianship, and while Harry Potter's guardianship was not formally processed through our standard channels, she let that land, she watched it land, she watched Vernon understand that she knew, the original placement recommendation, which I have a copy of, and which I'd be happy to show you, makes it very clear that this placement was intended to be a temporary and officially supervised arrangement. 4 years of zero official oversight is a gap I am here to close. She looked at him steadily. So I will ask you one more time, Mr. Dursley, to please show me where Harry is. The sitting room was quiet. From somewhere very close, from the hallway, in fact, there was the soft, unmistakable sound of a cupboard door being opened from the outside. They all heard it. They all knew what it meant. Vernon moved first, starting toward the hall, and Amelia said, Mr. Dursley, and something in her voice stopped him the way a wall stopped things, and then from the hallway came Okafor's voice, quiet and calm and utterly steady, Hello, mate. Harry was standing in the cupboard doorway when Amelia came into the hallway. He was small, she'd known he would be small, the photographs had prepared her, but photographs didn't prepare you for the reality of a child who was small in a way that was the result of decisions made by the adults around him. He was wearing a shirt that was 3 sizes too big and trousers held up with a piece of string and trainers that were adult-sized, stuffed at the toes with what appeared to be rolled newspaper. His hair was a catastrophic dark cloud. His glasses, thick-lensed, NHS issue, were held together at one arm with a piece of tape. He was looking at Okafor with the careful attention of someone assessing a new situation, not with fear. This was the thing that Amelia registered immediately and filed away, the thing that would come back to her later when she was writing her report. Not afraid. Assessing. The bright green eyes behind the mended glasses moved from Okafor to Amelia to Gemma with quick, systematic intelligence, and there was something in the quality of that gaze that was much older than 4 years old. The scar on his forehead was clearly visible. It was exactly what the description said, lightning bolt, slightly raised, white against his temple. "Hello," Harry said. His voice was clear. "Are you from the school?" "No," Amelia said. She crouched down so they were at eye level with each other, which meant she was crouching quite low. "My name is Amelia." "What's your name?" "Harry." He considered her. He looked at her monocle with frank curiosity. "What's that?" "It helps me see better." "My glasses help me see better too," he said. "They're a bit big, though." "I can see that." She held his gaze. He held hers, comfortable with the sustained attention in the way of children who had spent a lot of time watching adults and not been watched back. "Harry, I work for a sort of special organization. We look after children. We make sure they're all right. Would it be okay if we had a chat?" "About what?" he asked. Not defensive. Genuinely curious. "About how things are here. Whether you like it here. Whether there are things you'd change, if you could." She kept her voice even, conversational. "That sort of thing." Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at Uncle Vernon, who was in the sitting room doorway, and his expression did something very small and very specific, a slight careful neutralizing, the kind of expression a 4-year-old had no business knowing how to produce. Then he looked back at Amelia and said, "Could we go outside?" "Of course," she said. She stood up. She looked at Okafor, who gave her a very slight nod and moved to stand near the sitting room doorway, which had the effect of very politely preventing Vernon Dursley from following them without technically blocking him. She looked at Vernon, who was red-faced and tightly silent and doing the calculation of a man who had decided, provisionally, that making a scene would be worse than allowing this. "The garden?" she said to Harry. "Yes please," said Harry, and walked past her to the back door with the air of a child who had spent considerable time learning the fastest route out of this house. The garden was the same as all the gardens on the street except that it had a rockery, an empty one now, and an old garden bench that listed slightly to the right and a hedge that needed cutting. Harry sat on the garden bench and Amelia sat beside him, and Gemma Alcott stood at a respectful distance near the back fence, and the October afternoon sat around them with the pale particular quality of English light that was already thinking about winter. Harry looked at the empty rockery. He had the expression of someone noting an absence. "Do you like animals?" Amelia asked. "Some," he said. "Snakes are interesting." She was quiet for a moment. "Why snakes?" He shrugged the shrug of a child who has an answer but isn't sure if it's the right kind of answer to give. "They mind their own business," he said. "Mostly." Amelia thought about 647 snakes and a ministry atrium and smiled without meaning to. "That's one way of looking at it," she said. "Harry, I'm going to ask you some questions and I want you to know that there are no wrong answers. I just want to know what's true, all right? Can you do that for me?" He looked at her with those assessing eyes. Then he nodded. She asked carefully. She'd done this before, knew the difference between leading and open-ended, knew how to give a child space to fill without pushing them toward a particular shape. She asked about meals, about school, about where he slept, about whether he had friends, about whether anyone had ever hurt him, each question placed like a footstep on uncertain ground. Harry answered. He answered in the careful way of someone who had learned which truths were safe to say and which weren't, but who, when given a listener that felt genuinely safe, was constitutionally unable to not tell the truth. It came out in pieces, not dramatic, not performed, just matter of fact, the way 4-year-olds stated facts before they learned to soften them. He slept in the cupboard. He ate what was left after Dudley was finished. He wasn't supposed to ask for things or touch Dudley's things or use the bathroom after 9 o'clock at night without permission. He'd never been to a birthday party. He didn't know when his birthday was. He said all of this in a tone that was simply informative, because it was simply his life, and Amelia held her expression steady and her pen steady and her voice steady, and beside the fence Gemma Alcott's hand had gone very still on her case file. The cupboard, Amelia said. Has that been your bedroom the whole time you've lived here? Yes, Harry said. It's all right, actually. I've got a torch. I found it in the bin. He said this with a slight note of pride. I fixed it. You fixed it? I don't know how, he said, matter-of-factly. It just worked when I touched it. Things do that sometimes. He glanced at her, very quickly, with a different quality of attention, watchful. Testing how she received this. Aunt Petunia says I'm not to talk about it. Amelia kept her voice completely casual. What kind of things? When I'm cold, the blanket gets warmer, he said slowly. When I dropped my lunch last week and it was going to break the plate, it stopped. In the air. For a bit. He was watching her very carefully now, reading her face with that older-than-4 attention. Are you going to say it's not normal? No, she said. I'm going to tell you it's very normal, for a specific sort of person, and that you're one of those people. She looked at him steadily. Has anyone ever told you that? He shook his head. Has anyone ever told you anything about your parents? He shook his head again, but this time the careful neutrality on his face shifted, just for a moment, into something younger and more exposed. Your parents were wonderful people, Amelia said. She kept her voice even, because making it soft would be condescending and he didn't need soft, he needed true. Your father was James Potter. Your mother was Lily Potter, who was born Lily Evans. She watched his face. Lily was your Aunt Petunia's sister. Harry looked at the rockery. He was very still. They died when you were very small, she said. Not because they wanted to leave you. They were protecting you. There was a man, a very bad man, who wanted to hurt you, and they stood between you and him. She paused. They loved you very much. I want you to know that. The garden was quiet. Somewhere down the street a car reversed out of a driveway. The October light was going golden at the edges. Okay, Harry said. His voice was very small. Then, after a moment, what were they like? And Amelia Bones, who had known James Potter slightly and known Lily Potter better, who had worked alongside Lily briefly during the First War, who remembered a young woman with her same stubbornness and better humor, found that she had things to say, and said them, and spent 10 minutes on a garden bench in Little Whinging giving a 4-year-old boy his first true account of the people who had made him. He listened with absolute stillness. His hands were in his lap. His eyes were very bright. When she finished he said, quietly and with devastating directness, why did I have to live here, then? Because someone made a mistake, Amelia said. She met his eyes. And I'm here to fix it. Inside the house, things had deteriorated in the way that things deteriorated when a fundamentally dishonest person was forced into proximity with the evidence of their dishonesty. Vernon had tried, initially, to engage Gemma Alcott's colleagues, young Yates, who had the patience of a person who has handled significantly more volatile situations than this, in an argument about jurisdiction and the rights of Muggle householders and what exactly constituted ministry oversight and who exactly had the authority to just walk into a man's house on a Tuesday afternoon making accusations. Yates had listened to this with complete professional equanimity and not agreed with any of it. Petunia had not participated in this argument. She'd sat in the armchair by the window, not the sofa, the armchair, the one that was slightly separate from everything else, and looked at the tea tray that nobody had touched, and said nothing, and her hands were very still in her lap in a way that looked like self-control and was perhaps the closest thing to honesty she was able to manage in the current circumstances. When Amelia came back in from the garden, Harry remained outside with Gemma, who was conducting a more detailed welfare assessment. She looked at Petunia and Petunia looked at her, and the sitting room was quiet except for Vernon, who was in the middle of telling Yates that he paid his taxes and had never done anything wrong in his life. Mrs. Dursley, Amelia said. Vernon stopped talking. Petunia, Amelia said, using the first name deliberately, not unkindly. I need to ask you some questions separately. Would you come with me to the kitchen? Petunia stood up. She did not look at Vernon. In the kitchen, Amelia closed the door and placed the case file on the kitchen table and sat down across from Petunia, who sat with her back perfectly straight and her hands in her lap and her eyes on a point just beside Amelia's head. "You knew," Amelia said. "Not an accusation. A fact being laid on the table. When we knocked on the door, you knew exactly who we were and why we were here." Petunia said nothing. "The letter was in your garden for 4 years. It was delivered by an owl post on November 2nd, 1981, the day after your sister died, and you never opened it. It explains what Harry is, who he is, where he comes from, and you had it and you left it in the garden." She paused. "I don't think you left it because you didn't care. I think you left it because opening it meant accepting that he was real, and that what he represents is real. And then you would have had to decide what to do about it." Petunia's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright. She was looking at the wall. "My sister," she said, finally, "was everything in our house. Everything. Every room. My parents," she stopped. "She was magical and you weren't," Amelia said. "She was everything," Petunia said again, and this time the precision of her voice slipped, just at the edge of it, just the way a very carefully reinforced structure develops a hairline crack before it holds. "And then she was gone. And he was there, on my doorstep, and he looked, he has her eyes. He has her exact eyes. Did you know that?" "Yes," Amelia said quietly. "I couldn't," she stopped again. She reassembled. Vernon wanted nothing to do with it. Any of it. He was terrified of the boy from the start, that strange things kept happening around him. I thought if we kept it ordinary, kept it controlled, it would just be ordinary. He'd grow up ordinary and go away eventually and be ordinary somewhere else. He's a child," Amelia said. "Not a problem to be managed." Petunia looked at her for the first time, directly, and there was something in the look that was neither the defensive blankness nor the careful control, something much older and rawer. "I know that," she said. "I have always known that." Her voice was quiet. "That's what makes it worse." The kitchen was very still. "Petunia," Amelia said. "I'm going to be honest with you. The case I'm building involves multiple failures by multiple people and institutions. Your treatment of Harry is part of that case. I won't pretend otherwise." She held the woman's gaze. "But I'm also aware that you were handed a child by a man who didn't ask your permission, didn't give you resources or support or information, didn't arrange any follow-up, and left you to manage it with no preparation. That context matters. It doesn't change what happened. But it matters." Petunia looked at the table. Her hands, Amelia noticed, were trembling slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. "Harry comes with us today. He'll be placed in proper ministry-supervised care while the investigation is ongoing." She paused. "And I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about how he came to be here. Every detail. The letter, the man who brought him, anything you remember." Petunia closed her eyes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she opened them and said, in the voice of someone who had been deciding to do something for several years and was finally doing it, "He arrived on a motorbike. The man who left the baby. Not Dumbledore, Dumbledore came separately, he was already there when I opened the door. There was another man, enormous, on a flying motorbike, and he handed Harry to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore put him on our step and said," she paused. "He said the blood protects him." Those exact words. "And then they both left." She looked at Amelia. "They didn't ask. They just left him. The flying motorbike. The enormous man." Amelia wrote it down, already knowing what she was adding to, already seeing the shape of it. Sirius Black had been arrested the day after the Potters died. Which meant he hadn't ridden a motorbike to the Dursleys. Which meant the enormous man on the motorbike was someone else, someone who had taken Black's motorbike before Black was arrested, or borrowed it, or been given it, she made herself finish the note before she followed that line of thinking. It would wait. It would keep. She closed the file. "Thank you, Petunia." Petunia looked at her. "He doesn't, he'll know someone was supposed to come for him. Sooner or later. He'll know he was supposed to be somewhere else." Her voice was flat, factual, the way things were flat when they were true and painful and had been true for a long time. "He's already worked it out, I think. He works things out." "Yes," Amelia said. "He does." She went to get Harry. Harry was sitting on the Listing Garden bench when she came back out, and he had his knees drawn up and his arms around them, and he was looking at the back fence with an expression of complete thoughtfulness. Gemma was nearby, noting something in her file. She glanced up and gave Amelia the careful nod that said, "A great deal." "I got a great deal." "Harry," Amelia said. "We're going to go now. I'd like you to come with us." He looked up at her. "Where?" "Somewhere better than this." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the house, the kitchen window, the back door, the bedroom windows above. He looked at it the way someone looked at a place they were deciding how to feel about, when their feelings were complicated by the fact that it was the only place they'd ever known. Then he got down off the bench. "Can I get my torch?" he asked. "Of course." He went inside, and came back 2 minutes later with the broken repaired torch and a small balled-up sock with something hard in it. When Amelia looked, it was a collection of interesting stones, the kind a child picked up on walks and decided were worth keeping. That was everything he brought. That was, evidently, everything he had. He walked through the back gate and into the side passage and out to the front of the house without looking back, and Amelia walked beside him, and behind them the door of number 4 opened and Petunia Dursley stood in it for a moment watching them go. Harry didn't look back. But Petunia kept watching until they turned the corner. And there was something in her face, in the last moment before they disappeared, that was neither guilt nor relief nor grief but all three, tangled together, the look of a woman for whom this moment was both an end and a reckoning that was only beginning. In the front garden, Harry stopped. He looked up at Amelia. "You said there are no wrong answers," he said. "That's right. I dreamed about snakes last night. Hundreds of them. All moving somewhere." He watched her face with his bright careful eyes. "Is that strange?" Amelia looked down at him, at this small, thin, extraordinary child who had summoned half the serpents in Britain in his sleep and started the most significant investigation of the decade without knowing he'd done any of it, and she said, "No, Harry. That's not strange at all. That's just you." He considered this. Then he nodded, as if it confirmed something he'd been working out, and walked to the waiting car. Chapter 4, The Boy Who Commanded the Ministry Guest Quarters Were Not Designed for Children. This was obvious from the moment Amelia brought Harry through the flue. He stepped out of the fireplace into the third-floor residential suite with green fire still fading behind him, looked around at the adult-scaled furniture and the absence of anything resembling personality, and said, "It's very brown," with the clinical accuracy of someone who called things what they were. "It is," Amelia agreed. "We'll fix that." "You don't have to," he said, which was the response of a child who had learned not to expect things to be fixed. She looked at him. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He absorbed this. Decided to believe it, provisionally, with the careful hopefulness of someone extending a small amount of credit. He set his sock of stones on the brown table and put the torch beside it and walked to the window, which looked out over the Thames, the late afternoon light breaking silver across it. "Is that the river?" he asked. "The Thames, yes. I've never seen it." She stood beside him at the window. "You've lived 20 miles from it your whole life." "I know," he said simply. They stood for a moment looking at the river together. Then Harry turned around and began a systematic inspection of the suite, opening cupboards, and checking under the bed and examining the bathroom taps with the thoroughness of someone who had always been responsible for knowing his own environment. Amelia watched this and felt that cold clear thing in her chest again, the feeling of a case that mattered, sharpened now to something more personal. She had gone to Privet Drive to gather evidence. She had come back with a small, singular person who turned on the taps to check the water pressure and nodded with professional satisfaction when they worked. The healer arrived at 6. His name was Marcus Webb, a senior healer from St. Mungo's who specialized in pediatric cases with magical complications, and he had the unhurried manner of a person who had learned that children responded better to someone who didn't act like they were in a hurry. He sat on the floor of the suite, the floor, Harry noticed, not the chair, and opened his bag with the deliberate casualness of someone who was not making a big deal of anything. "I'm going to do a few checks," he told Harry. "They don't hurt. Some of them feel a bit warm, that's all." "What kind of checks?" Harry asked. He'd sat down on the floor opposite Webb with the air of someone who had decided to match the floor-sitting energy. "Finding out how you're getting on. How your body's doing. Like a map of how things are." Webb glanced at him. "You can ask me questions while I work." Harry considered this offer seriously. "What's the light for?" he asked, when Webb produced a small diagnostic wand that emitted a soft gold glow. "It reads your magical core. Tells me how it's developing." He moved it slowly. "You have a question about that? What's a magical core?" Webb explained, matter-of-factly, the way he'd have explained anything else. Harry listened with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that were interesting, head slightly tilted, very still, occasionally asking follow-up questions that were precisely targeted. What did it feel like when it was working? Whether it could be turned off. Whether all people had one or just some people. "Just some," Webb told him. "A specific kind of person." "Aunt Petunia doesn't have one," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "Probably not. That's why she didn't like me," Harry said. "Flat, factual, not self-pitying. She was scared of the things I did." Webb paused in his work. "That might be part of it," he said. "She wasn't very good at scared," Harry said. "She made it look like angry. But it was scared underneath." He looked at the diagnostic wand's gold glow. "I could tell." Webb filed this away and continued his assessment. When he was done he packed his bag and stood up, and his face was carefully arranged but his eyes weren't, and Amelia, reading them from across the room, saw the list of findings before he gave it to her privately in the hall. Underweight, significantly. Mildly anemic. Vitamin deficient. Old bruising in 2 places, a forearm and a shoulder, consistent with being gripped hard, though not recent. The magical core was extraordinary, the most robust he'd measured in a child that age, vibrant and active, which was, Webb told Amelia quietly, remarkable given that magical cores typically flourished with emotional stability and nurturing, and this child had been raised without either. "He should have had a compromised core," Webb said. "Given what you've told me about the environment. Instead he searched for the word. Defiant. Like it decided to grow without permission." "That," Amelia said, "sounds exactly right." She went back in to find Harry had arranged his stones in a row along the windowsill in order of size and was explaining them to himself in a quiet undertone, narrating their origins and their qualities the way a child narrated things when they'd been alone long enough to become their own best company. He stopped when she came in and looked at her with an expression that was ready for whatever came next. "Marcus says you're going to be completely fine," Amelia told him. "You need to eat more. That's the main thing." "I know," Harry said. "I'm hungry most of the time." "I know you are," she said. "That's going to change." She sat down in the brown armchair and looked at him directly. "Harry. There are things I want to tell you. About why you're here, and what's happening. You can ask me anything. I'll tell you the truth." He sat down on the end of the bed. "Okay," he said. She told him. She kept it clear, kept it honest, stripped it of anything that would confuse or overwhelm. She told him about the ministry, about wizards, about what he was. She told him about the investigation, not the details, but the shape of it, that people had come forward on his behalf, that there were people working to make sure he was properly taken care of. She did not tell him yet about Sirius Black, because that thread wasn't pulled far enough yet and she wouldn't give him hope she couldn't confirm. She told him about Hogwarts, briefly, that there was a school, that he'd go when he was older, that it was for people like him. Harry listened to all of it. When she finished there was a silence, not an uncomfortable one, just the silence of a great deal of information being sorted by a very active mind. "The people who came forward on my behalf," he said. "Who were they?" Amelia looked at him. "Snakes," she said. Harry stared at her. Then something changed in his face, a spreading recognition, quiet and certain, the look of someone who had just had an inexplicable feeling explained. "My dream," he said. "Yes. I called them. In your sleep. You spoke in a language, a very old magical language, and they heard you. All of them, all across the country. And they came here." He was very still. His eyes were bright. "What did I say?" "Sinistra, the woman who translated for us, said you gave a formal summons. Not just a request. A command. The kind that hasn't been heard in Britain for a very long time." She paused. "They brought evidence, Harry. Of what your life was like. Letters, documents, their own testimony. They gave us everything we needed to come and get you." The room was quiet. The Thames moved beyond the window, silver going bronze in the last of the afternoon light. Harry was looking at his hands, small, thin hands, the knuckles slightly prominent, the right index finger ink-stained from the school exercise book. "I didn't know I did it," he said. "I know. But they still came. 647 of them," Amelia said. "And the oldest one came from Godric's Hollow. It was there the night your parents died. It's been waiting there for 4 years." Harry looked up. His expression was extraordinary, not overwhelmed, not frightened, but moved, in the way that people were moved by things that confirmed something they'd always known without words for it. "Can I see them?" he asked. "The snakes. Can I go to the atrium?" "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight you eat and sleep in an actual bed." He looked at the bed. It was a very ordinary ministry guest bed, brown like everything else, but it was approximately 5 times larger than his cot at Privet Drive and it had 3 pillows. He studied it with the expression of someone doing a cost-benefit analysis. "All right," he said. Dumbledore arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, which told Amelia everything about his state of mind. Albus Dumbledore was never exactly on time. He was either early, in the expansive, comfortable manner of a man who wanted to set the agenda, or late in the way that was also a form of agenda setting, arriving after everyone had arranged themselves and forcing a rearrangement. Exactly on time meant he was uncertain, which meant he'd spent the morning thinking hard and hadn't quite resolved what he was going to say. She met him in the conference room, not her office. The conference room had the documents in it. He came in looking exactly as he always looked, the long silver beard, the half-moon spectacles, the deep blue robes with the faint pattern of stars, the whole performance of benign magnificence that had been so consistently maintained over so many decades that most people had stopped seeing it as a performance at all. His eyes were their usual cornflower blue, alert, warm, the kind that made you feel individually perceived. Amelia was immune to them. She'd been immune since 1979 when she'd watched him manage a Wisingamot vote on Auror conduct standards with the seamless skill of a man who had been managing Wisingamot votes longer than most of the members had been alive. She'd respected the skill. She'd never entirely trusted the smile. "Amelia," he said warmly. "I came as soon as I received your summons. I understand there's been a rather remarkable event. Sit down, Albus." He sat, which meant he'd decided on a posture of cooperation. She noted it, didn't trust it. She placed the letter in front of him. His own letter, the private one from Godric's Hollow, the one that wasn't a letter at all. He looked at it, and for just a moment, less than a moment, a fraction, something moved behind the half-moon glasses. Then the warmth came back and he looked up at her. "I see," he said. "The garden snake that lived in Lily Potter's garden brought it in this morning," Amelia said. "Along with testimony from the night of October 31st. And testimony from November 2nd, describing the events you wrote about in that letter." She opened her notes. "Specifically, you placed Harry Potter at 4 Privet Drive without following ministry placement protocols. Without notifying this department. Without filing a formal guardianship application. Without arranging any inspection or oversight of the household." She looked at him directly. "We have a document from this department, signed by Crouch Sr., recommending Harry Potter be placed with his godfather, Sirius Black. That document was never delivered. And Sirius Black was placed in Azkaban the following day without a trial." She set down her pen. "I want to know what you know about that sequence of events." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, she watched him very carefully, not for guilt, she'd find guilt easily enough, but for the particular texture of his thinking, the way he assembled his response, which would tell her what he was and wasn't prepared to account for. "Sirius was not my first concern in those hours," he said. His voice was measured, careful, not defensive. This, she knew, was his most sophisticated mode. The child was. Harry was. The threat to him was immediate and you had a process, Amelia said. One that this ministry designed specifically for situations like this. A process you bypassed. A process that would have taken weeks, and in the meantime, Sirius Black could have been investigated and confirmed as a suitable guardian, and Harry Potter could have been in temporary ministry housing, exactly as he is now, within 48 hours. She kept her voice level. The process exists, Albus, because the alternative is exactly what happened. Individual judgment replacing institutional safeguards. Your judgment about Petunia Dursley replacing this department's judgment about the welfare of a child. Petunia's blood creates a magical protection around a boy that no ministry safehouse can replicate. He spent 4 years sleeping in a cupboard, Amelia said. Her voice didn't rise. It just became very specific. Underweight. Vitamin deficient. Old bruising. Never told his birthday. Never told his parents' names. Never told what he was. She looked at him. The protection kept Voldemort out. It didn't keep anything else out. And you knew, when you left him there, that Petunia was not a warm woman. You wrote that yourself. The conference room was quiet. The pile of documents sat between them. Dumbledore looked at them, not avoiding them, not dismissing them, looking at them with the expression of a man who had known this accounting would come, had perhaps even thought he was prepared for it, and was discovering he wasn't. I believed, he said slowly, that the protection outweighed everything else. You believe that, Amelia said. Harry paid for that belief. A silence. Is he here? Dumbledore asked. Yes. I would very much like to, not today, Amelia said. The welfare assessment is ongoing. Contact with people involved in the decisions that led to his placement is restricted for the duration. She paused. That includes you. He looked at her. He did not argue. She wondered if he'd expected it. She thought he might have walked in here prepared for exactly this, might even have considered it, on some level, appropriate. She didn't trust the acceptance yet. She'd seen him accept things before and then quietly reroute around them. There's a second matter, she said. Sirius Black. He was very still. The testimony from Godric's Hollow places Peter Pettigrew as the secret keeper, not Black. Multiple serpent witnesses corroborate each other. The account is internally consistent and corroborated by the placement letter. If Black was, in fact, the one who betrayed the Potters, why was there a ministry letter the next day recommending him as Harry's guardian? Crouch signed that letter. She watched his face. What do you know about Peter Pettigrew? Dumbledore's hands were still on the table. His eyes were very careful. "I had suspicions," he said at last, "about Peter. After the fact. Suspicions I never acted on," Amelia finished. "No. Because Sirius was already in Azkaban and the war was over and acting on them would have required reopening everything and you believed," she paused. "What did you believe, Albus? Why didn't you act on them?" He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower, older than usual, the performance worn thin. "I believed the greater good had been served," he said. "The war was over. The boy was safe. I told myself, that Sirius had made his choices, and that Peter," he stopped. "Where is Peter Pettigrew?" Amelia asked. "I don't know," Dumbledore said. "That is the honest truth. I don't know." She wrote it down. She wrote everything down. When she was done she closed her file and looked at him across the table and said, "I'm going to need you to give a formal statement. Witnessed, documented, under veritaserum if you consent." He could refuse. The veritaserum component, at least, he could refuse. She couldn't compel it at this stage, not without Wisengamot authorization. She watched him understand this, watched him decide. "I consent," he said. She hadn't expected that. She let it sit for a moment, reading it. Then she nodded and wrote it down and said, "Thursday, 9 o'clock. This room." He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "Amelia," he said. "The boy, Harry. How is he?" She looked at him. "He's sleeping in a real bed for the first time in his life," she said. "He seems fine. He's always been fine. That is, somehow, the worst part." Dumbledore left. She sat with the documents for a moment after he'd gone, listening to the quiet of the conference room, the distant sounds of the ministry going about its afternoon above and below her. Harry met the Snakes the following morning. He stood at the edge of the atrium in borrowed clothes that actually fit him. Gemma Alcott had produced them from somewhere, plain jeans and a dark green jumper, and he'd looked at clothes that fit the way people looked at things they hadn't realized were an option, and he looked at the vast quiet gathering of serpents on the ministry floor, and he was entirely unafraid. Sinistra was beside him. She'd been in the atrium so long at this point she'd begun to feel like furniture, though considerably more useful than the actual furniture. She looked at Harry the way she'd been looking at him since Amelia had told her about him yesterday evening, with the expression of a scientist who has just had a theoretical framework confirmed by evidence that is even more extraordinary than the theory predicted. "Can I talk to them?" Harry asked. "That's rather the question," Sinistra said. Do you know if you've ever spoken Parseltongue before?" "Consciously?" Harry thought about it with genuine seriousness. "I don't know what Parseltongue is," he said. "It's the language of snakes. The one you spoke in your sleep 2 nights ago." He looked at the snakes. Then he did something that Sinistra would describe in her published account of this case as the most natural thing I've ever seen a Parselmouth do. He just talked to them. Not attempting it, not trying to find the language, just opening his mouth and speaking, the way you spoke to something that you expected to understand you. What came out was Parseltongue. Immediate, fluent, with the particular idiomatic phrasing of the old dialect, the formal register that the senior snakes used. The effect was immediate. The 647 snakes reacted the way a crowd reacted to something they'd been waiting for, a collective shift, a kind of settling and alerting simultaneously, every head orienting toward the small dark-haired boy at the edge of the atrium. The nearest ones moved toward him, not aggressively, but with the purposeful affection of creatures that had come a very long way to be here and were now being acknowledged. Harry crouched down. The nearest adder came to him and he held out his hand and it moved across it and he looked at it with complete attention, listening, his face doing the thing faces did when people were listening to something said in a language they thought in naturally, fluid, responsive, a conversation, not a translation. Sinistra was taking notes with a hand that wasn't quite steady. He talked to them for an hour. Not continuously, it was a conversation, or several conversations, the way Harry moved from cluster to cluster with the comfort of someone walking through a room of people they knew. He was 4 years old and he had no self-consciousness about any of it, no awareness that it was extraordinary, no performance of being extraordinary. He was just there, speaking, listening, responding. Occasionally he laughed. Once he looked very serious about something for a moment, and then he nodded slowly like someone absorbing difficult information. He came back to Sinistra eventually and sat down on the floor next to her. "They said I called them," he said. "Yes. They're not angry. About being called, I mean. They say," he paused, finding the words in English for something he'd just heard in a different language, "they say a true speaker has the right to call. It's in the old law. The law they have." He looked at her. "They were going to come anyway," the old one said. "Even if I hadn't called. They'd been watching for a long time." "The old one," Sinistra said. "The one from Godric's Hollow." "Yes." Harry looked at the ancient adder, coiled in its place beneath the central light where it had been since it arrived. "She says she knew my mother. She lived in the garden when my parents were there. My mother used to bring her scraps sometimes." His voice was perfectly level. "She says my mother was kind to things." Sinistra did not trust herself to speak. "She also says," Harry's voice became very focused, the way it got when he was relaying something he considered particularly important. "She says the man who betrayed my parents isn't dead. The one they blamed Black for being. He's not dead. She says she saw him, before she came here. In the countryside. She says he smells like a man who is pretending to be something else." Sinistra put down her quill. She looked at Harry. "Peter Pettigrew," she said, very quietly. Harry looked at her. "Who's that?" "Someone we've been looking for," she said. "Harry, this is important." "Did she say where?" He turned back to the old adder and asked. The exchange was brief, specific. The adder answered with the precision of something that had been carrying this information carefully for a long time. Harry turned back to Sinistra. "She says the countryside west of Ottery St. Catchpole," he said. "There's a family there, a large family with red hair. He's been living with them. Small and soft and frightened. She says the children call him Scabbers." Sinistra was on her feet. She was calling for Edgar Tipton before she'd consciously decided to. Harry watched her go, then turned back to the old adder, who was watching him with those amber gold eyes that held 30 years of patient waiting in everything they'd seen. He sat with her for a long time. He told her, in Parseltongue, what Amelia had told him about his mother, not all of it, just the parts that felt right to say out loud. He told her that his mother used to bring her scraps. He said he was glad to know that. The ancient adder regarded him, and her response, when Sinistra read the transcription later that evening, she had to stop and sit very still for a moment. Her response was this: "Your mother knew you would be worth waiting for. We disagreed about many things. We agreed on that." Amelia was at her desk when Edgar arrived at speed. She listened to what he had to say. She put down her pen. She picked up her pen again. Then she stood up. "Get me an horror team," she said. "Not a full unit, 4 people, quiet approach. And get me Dumbledore's home flu address. He said he'd cooperate. This is where that starts." She looked out the window at London's afternoon sky and thought about a man who'd been in Azkaban for 4 years without a trial, and a rat who'd been someone's pet for the same 4 years, and a child who'd been sleeping in a cupboard for all of them. And the common thread, the thing that pulled it into a coherent shape, was a 4-year-old who'd spoken in his sleep and set everything in motion. She picked up her cloak. She looked at the door, beyond which the ministry was going about its complicated business, its politics and its compromises and its habits of convenient blindness. "Right," she said to no one. "Let's go find Peter Pettigrew." Chapter 5, Azkaban's loose thread. The Weasley family did not, as a rule, have a quiet Tuesday. This Tuesday was no exception. The Burrow, which was the name of the Weasley home, bestowed by some ancestor with either a sense of irony or an accurate understanding of the structural situation, stood at the edge of Ottery St. Catchpole in the way that things stood when they had not been planned but had simply accumulated over time, adding rooms and staircases and extensions in the organic manner of something that grew rather than was built. It listed slightly east. It smelled of baking and garden and old spells and the particular comfortable chaos of a house that contained, on this Tuesday, Arthur and Molly Weasley and 6 of their 7 children, the youngest of whom, Ginny, was approximately the same age as Harry Potter and was currently attempting to catch a garden gnome by hiding in the cabbage patch with aggressive patience. The 3 middle boys, Fred, George, and Percy, were in the garden in various states of post-breakfast activity. Fred and George were doing something with a degnoming bucket that Percy was officially not involved in. Ron, who was 5 and the most recent addition to the younger bracket before Ginny's arrival, was sitting on the back step with his hand in a box. The box contained a rat. The rat was gray, slightly shabby, with a missing toe on its right front paw that Ron considered a distinguished feature. His name was Scabbers, and he had been in the Weasley family for 12 years, passed down from Percy's brief ownership with the vague casualness of a creature that nobody was entirely sure how they'd acquired. He was not a remarkable rat. He was not particularly affectionate, as rats went. He had a tendency to sleep in inconvenient places and wake with a startled viciousness that Ron found thrilling and everyone else found annoying. He was not, as it happened, a rat at all. Ron was trying to teach Scabbers a trick, specifically, the trick of sitting up on his hind legs and holding a piece of cheese, which Ron had decided was achievable based on information from no credible source, when the sound reached the garden. Not a dramatic sound. Just the soft crack of apparition from multiple points, distributed around the property with the professional spacing of people who had been taught to do this correctly. Ron looked up. Scabbers went very still on his palm. 4 people appeared in the field adjacent to the Burrow's garden, and they were wearing ministry robes, and one of them was Amelia Bones. Molly Weasley came out the back door 2 seconds later with the timing of a woman whose instincts for her family's safety had been honed during a war and had never entirely stood down. She was a broad, red-haired woman with flour on her hands and the particular quality of attention that motherhood developed in people who were paying it properly. She saw the ministry robes and her expression shifted through several things very quickly before settling on something controlled and wary. "Can I help you?" she said. "Mrs. Weasley," Amelia said pleasantly. "I'm Amelia Bones, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I apologize for arriving without notice. We're looking for a small animal, a rat, that we believe may be on your property." She kept her voice conversational, the way she kept it conversational when she wanted to see how people reacted to information before they'd had time to arrange their reaction. Molly Weasley looked at the Aurors. Looked at Amelia. Looked at Ron, who was sitting on the back step with his hand in a box, and said, with tremendous maternal intuition, "Ron, come inside, love." "But Mum, inside." Ron came inside. The box came with him. Scabbers, inside the box, had gone from his usual torpor to a specific vibrating stillness that Ron did not notice because he was 5 and had not yet developed the ability to read rat body language as an indicator of human threat. Amelia watched the box go inside the house and said to Molly, calmly, "We're going to need to come in." The Burrows' kitchen was large and warm and full of the good domestic magic of a house where food was made with care and everyone had a seat at the table. Amelia sat at that table with Molly across from her and Arthur, who had been summoned from his ministry job in record time and arrived via flow looking like a man who had been running, beside his wife with his hands flat on the table and his expression of a person waiting to understand what was happening before deciding how to feel about it. Arthur Weasley was a kind man. This was apparent in the particular quality of his attention. He was listening, genuinely listening, not performing listening. Amelia had always had a certain amount of professional affection for Arthur Weasley, who worked in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office and approached his job with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who was interested in the thing itself, not just the status of doing it. She explained, briefly. The investigation. The serpent testimony. The specific piece of testimony regarding a rat with a missing toe on its right front paw, living with a wizarding family near Ottery St. Catchpole. She did not explain Peter Pettigrew beyond what was necessary to explain why a rat was significant. Molly Weasley's face did several things during this explanation. The final thing it did was look at the box that Ron had brought inside and set down under the kitchen table, and the expression that settled on her was the expression of a woman making a rapid and thorough reassessment of her life. "Scabbers," she said. "If our information is correct," Amelia said, "yes. He's been with us for 12 years, Arthur said slowly. He was already old when Percy got him. Nobody quite remembered where he'd come from. He was just there. 12 years is a long time for a rat," Amelia said. The Weasleys looked at each other. The look passed between them with the efficiency of two people who had been married long enough to hold entire conversations that way. "Ron," Molly said. Ron appeared in the kitchen doorway immediately, which meant he'd been listening from the hallway, which was entirely predictable for a 5-year-old who had been brought inside while interesting things were happening. He had the box under his arm and his freckled face was very serious. "He's mine," he said. "I know, love," Molly said. Her voice was gentler than the occasion. "Can you put him on the table?" Ron looked at Amelia. Amelia looked back at him with the particular direct attention she gave to everyone, and something in it, the fact that she was treating him as a person worth looking at directly, not a small inconvenience to be managed, made Ron put the box on the table with the careful gravity of someone handing over something important. Scabbers was in the corner of the box with his eyes open and his body flat, pressed down in the way of small animals when they were attempting to be as small as possible. Amelia took out her wand. She looked at Scabbers. Scabbers looked at the space beside her head, not at her, which was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to cast a revealing charm," she said, to the room. "If he's what we think he is, the result will be immediate and, you should be prepared. It will not be comfortable to watch." Molly moved Ron behind her with the automatic precision of someone for whom the placement of children behind her body was a deeply ingrained reflex. Amelia cast the charm. Peter Pettigrew became himself on the kitchen table of the Burrow on a Tuesday in October 1985, in the full presence of Amelia Bones, 2 Aurors, and the Weasley family, and the transformation was neither graceful nor dignified, which was perhaps appropriate. He was a short man, soft-featured, with the look of someone who had been frightened for so long that it had become the resting state of his face. He had thinning hair and watery eyes, and his right hand, when he held it up with the instinctive defensiveness of someone who'd just been forced into a shape they'd chosen to hide in, was missing a finger. He opened his mouth. Several sounds came out that didn't organize themselves into words. Ron, from behind his mother, said with remarkable composure, "That's not a rat." "No," Amelia agreed. "It isn't." She kept her wand on Pettigrew with the absolute steadiness of someone who had been surprised by things before and learned not to let surprise affect her aim. "Peter Pettigrew. You're under arrest under the Wizarding Statute of Magical Law 1847, Section 4, faking of death and fraudulent evasion of justice. You are also to be held for questioning in relation to the murders of Lily and James Potter, the street death of 12 Muggles, and the illegal imprisonment of Sirius Black." She paused. "Do you understand what I've said?" Pettigrew was shaking. Not with anger, not with defiance. With the specific fine trembling of a man whose ability to be afraid had been running on full power for 4 years and was now meeting the thing he'd been afraid of. "I didn't, it wasn't, Black. Black was the one who, we have testimony," Amelia said. "Sit down, Mr. Pettigrew." He sat. He had no choice. Okafor had moved to stand behind him with the undemonstrative physical presence of a man who was significantly larger and significantly more trained than the man he was standing behind. "You'll have the opportunity to give a full account," Amelia said. "Under the proper conditions. For now, where have you been for 4 years?" Pettigrew looked at the Weasley family. He looked at Arthur and Molly and the ginger-headed children visible in the doorway, and he seemed to be doing a calculation, the specific calculation of a cornered person assessing which story was most likely to help them. Then he looked at Amelia, and whatever he read in her face resolved the calculation. "Here," he said. "I've been here. And before this, I was in fields, gardens. Moving. I've been running since that night. Since Sirius found me." He was speaking faster now, the words coming out with the flooding urgency of something that had been held in for years and was now escaping through the first available opening. "He cornered me. In the street. I knew what he was going to do, he'd worked it out, he knew I was the one who told the Dark Lord, and I panicked. I made the explosion. Killed the Muggles. I didn't mean to kill that many, I just needed to get away, and then I ran, I turned and I ran, and Sirius," he stopped. "Sirius was arrested," Amelia said. I didn't plan that. I didn't know that would happen." He looked at her, and something in his expression was trying very hard to be conviction and was falling slightly short. "I was terrified. I just ran." "And you've been running for 4 years," she said. "As a rat. Living with a wizarding family, within reach of the magical world, within reach of the ministry where you could have turned yourself in at any time and cleared an innocent man." She let that sit for a moment. "Why didn't you?" He had no answer for that. Not a real one. He produced words, but they were the words of someone narrating a justification they'd spent 4 years constructing, and she dismantled each one with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already built the counter case. He had been afraid. He had been sure no one would believe him. He had told himself that Black being in prison wasn't so bad, that Black was angry enough to have done it even if he hadn't done that specifically. "He has a child," Amelia said. "Harry Potter has a godfather in Azkaban and has spent 4 years in a Muggle cupboard because you were afraid." Pettigrew looked at his hands. "Put him in the secure flue," Amelia told Yates. "Holding cell 3. She turned to the Weasleys. Molly was pale and very still. Arthur had his arm around her. Ron was looking at the space on the table where the box had been with the expression of a child processing a significant loss. "I'm very sorry," Amelia said, and meant it. "You've been nothing but cooperative and you had no way of knowing. If you need anything, if the children need support from the department's welfare service, we'll be fine," Molly said. She had the voice of someone who was going to be fine through sheer determination. "But I want to know, the man in Azkaban. Sirius Black. We're opening his case today," Amelia said. "He'll get his trial." Molly Weasley pressed her lips together and nodded, and there was something in the set of her jaw that said she was going to feel the weight of Scabbers, who was Pettigrew for a long time and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Ron looked up at Amelia. "Is Scabbers coming back?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "I'm afraid not." He considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who had not yet perfected the art of managing bad news gracefully, and then nodded once. "He bit me twice," he said, "so it's probably all right." Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. He knew this because counting was the only thing the Dementors couldn't take from him, and he'd been counting since the first day. Not because he thought the count would matter. Just because keeping the number meant keeping something, meant there was a him that was counting and a him that remembered what he was counting from and a him that would theoretically reach a number that was different from today's number. He didn't think much about getting out. In Azkaban, hope was the most dangerous thing you could have, because the Dementors fed on it specifically, pulling it out of you in long cold drafts, and the smarter prisoners, the ones who lasted, had learned not to give them the purchase. Sirius had been very clever, in his other life. In his other life he had been reckless and brilliant and full of a joy that came easily, the kind that overflowed, that made rooms louder and better. He could barely remember that person now. He remembered the shape of him, the outline. Like a drawing of something he'd once held. He sat in his cell on the Tuesday in question and thought about James, because that was the one thing the Dementors couldn't make worse, it was already the worst thing, it had always been the worst thing, and somewhere in the bottom of it, below the grief that had no bottom, there was something like bedrock. He thought about James's laugh. The specific quality of James's laugh, which had been ridiculous and contagious and had made everyone in a room feel like they'd done something worth laughing about even when they hadn't. He held on to it the way you held on to the last part of a rope. He did not hear the approach. He never heard the approach in Azkaban. Sound moved differently through the prison, muffled and distorted by the cold that wasn't just temperature. But he felt the change. A change in the particular quality of the despair that pressed against the cell walls like weather, a lightning, almost undetectable, like the moment before dawn when the dark was the same dark but something in it was different. He looked up. Amelia Bones was standing outside his cell. He didn't recognize her at first. She was a face from a world that had grown abstract through 4 years of Dementor proximity, like a word you'd repeated until it lost its meaning. Then it resolved. Amelia Bones, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who had testified at 3 Death Eater trials during the war with the composure of someone who had decided that composure was a form of justice in itself. He'd never known her well. He'd been too young, too peripheral. But he knew what she represented. Black, she said. His voice, when he produced it, had the texture of something that hadn't been used properly in a long time. Bones, he managed. She looked at him without the studied non-reaction of the Azkaban guards, who had perfected the art of not seeing the people in the cells. She looked at him directly and registered what she was seeing and didn't pretend otherwise. He could see the assessment in the steady gray eyes, not pity, not horror, just the honest acknowledgement of a person looking at what 4 years of wrongful imprisonment looked like on a human body. "I'm here to inform you that your case is being formally reviewed," she said. "We have new evidence. We have testimony. We have Peter Pettigrew in custody." He stared at her. "He's alive," she said. "He's been living as a rat with a wizarding family. We took him this morning." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand that this is real. I also need you to understand that the review process will take time, and that I need you to cooperate with it fully, formal statement, veritaserum if you're willing, the entire account." His hands were against the cold stone wall. He was looking at her with the expression of a man hearing something in a language he'd stopped believing was real. "Pettigrew," he said. The name came out strange, stripped of everything except the bare fact of it. "Alive," she said. "In custody. Talking." She paused. "We also have snake testimony from Godric's Hollow that corroborates what we believe your account will be. Multiple witnesses. Independent. Consistent. Snake testimony," he said. "It's a long story," she said. "And I'll tell you all of it. But first, Sirius. Harry is safe. He's been removed from Privet Drive and he's at the Ministry. She chose the word with care. He's extraordinary." Something happened to Sirius Black's face. Something that started behind his eyes and moved outward slowly, like light coming through ice, like the thing that had been in cold storage for 4 years encountering heat and deciding, cautiously, tentatively, with the extreme care of someone who had been badly burned before, to begin the process of thawing. "He's 4 years old," Amelia said. "And he called 600 snakes to the Ministry in his sleep and set this entire investigation in motion." She kept her voice steady, but there was something in it, a warmth that she didn't usually deploy professionally. "He did it for himself. Without knowing he was doing it. He is, Sirius, very much James Potter's son." The sound that came out of Sirius Black then was not something she categorized or described in her report. Some things were not evidence. She stayed for 40 minutes. She told him, piece by piece, the shape of it, the snakes, the evidence, Pettigrew, the Ministry letter, Dumbledore's letter, Privet Drive. She told him carefully, watching his face, giving him time to process each thing before moving to the next. He asked questions. He was coherent, she noted, more coherent than she'd expected after 4 years of Dementor proximity, which said something about what he'd been holding on to, and his questions were precise, the questions of someone whose intelligence had survived the cold. When she was done he said, "When? When what? When do I get out?" "That depends on the trial," she said. "We're moving for emergency Wiesengemot session. Given the evidence," she paused. "Given what we have, I don't expect it to take long. But I can't promise a date." "But there'll be a trial," he said. "Not quite a question." "There'll be a trial," she confirmed. "I promise you that." He leaned his head back against the stone wall. His eyes were closed. She could see his chest moving with the deliberate, controlled breathing of someone who had learned to manage states that were larger than breathing could handle. "He's really all right," he said. "Harry. He's sleeping in a proper bed," she said. "He's eating 3 meals a day. He met the snakes this morning and spent an hour talking to them and was completely unimpressed by how remarkable that was." She paused. "He asked if he could keep the oldest one." Something that might have been a laugh moved through Sirius. "Not quite, too rusty, too thin, for years of disuse in every line of it, but the ghost of one, the structural echo." "What did you say?" he asked. "I said we'd discuss it," she said. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with eyes that were gray and tired and had held on to something across 4 years that was, she thought, more impressive than anything else she'd seen in this case, and this case had contained extraordinary things. "Tell him," he said, "that his dad would have been, just incredibly smug about all of this." She stood up to leave. She paused. "Sirius. Is there anyone you want notified?" "Anyone who should know, Remus," he said. "Remus Lupin. He needs to know." He paused. "He'll think he knew this. He'll think he should have done something. Make sure someone tells him it wasn't." He stopped. "Just tell him to come." Harry was in the atrium when Amelia returned to the ministry. He'd been given the run of it, essentially, which was the outcome of several adults independently deciding that keeping Harry Potter in a brown room when 600 snakes in the atrium were patiently waiting for him was an absurd piece of bureaucratic insistence. He was sitting in the center of the floor with the ancient adder from Godric's Hollow coiled near his knee and 3 of the smaller garden adders in a loose arrangement around him, and he appeared to be telling them something. Whatever it was, they were listening with the full quality of their attention. Sinistra was nearby with her notes. She'd given up trying to document everything and was now doing what was essentially a running translation for her own comprehension, just trying to keep pace with what was being said. Amelia came to stand beside her. "What are they talking about?" "He's telling them about his parents," Sinistra said quietly. "What he knows. He's asking them about what they remember." She paused. "The old one has been telling him things all morning. She seems to have made a decision to give him everything she has, everything she knows about the Potters, from the years she lived there. He's been," she stopped. "Taking it in?" Amelia offered. "Building himself," Sinistra said. "That's what it looks like. Like he's constructing something solid from the material they're giving him." They watched him for a moment. He'd looked up when Amelia arrived, that peripheral awareness he always had, and given her the quick assessing glance and gone back to his conversation without interrupting it, which was its own kind of eloquence. He was comfortable. He was, in the middle of the ministry atrium surrounded by more than 600 snakes, more comfortable than he'd been at any point since she'd met him. "Pettigrew's in holding," Amelia told Sinistra. "And I've seen Black." Sinistra looked at her. "How is he?" "Alive," Amelia said. "Intact, which is more than he should be." He asked about Harry. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." She watched Harry, who had moved slightly to let a grass snake cross his lap and was conducting 3 parallel conversations now with serene ease. "He's going to need representation for the trial. Someone who knows the case from the inside." She turned to Sinistra. "I want you to document everything the snakes have told him today. His own account of what he's learned from them will be part of the case, eyewitness testimony mediated through a child Parselmouth is legally unusual, but it's consistent with the rules of serpent evidence. She paused. Make sure we have every word. Already have it, Sinistra said, lifting her notes. Good. Amelia turned to go. Director. Sinistra's voice stopped her. Do you know what he said, when he first sat down with the old one this morning? Before they got into the serious things. I translated it for my own notes. He sat down and he looked at her and he said, she glanced at the notes, you came a very long way. Thank you. I'm sorry you had to wait so long. Amelia looked at Harry, 4 years old, thin, in clothes that finally fit, his borrowed green jumper slightly grass-stained now from sitting on the ministry floor, his terrible glasses sliding down his nose, conducting the most significant piece of forensic information gathering the wizarding world had seen in a decade. He said that at 4 years old, she said. He said it in Parseltongue, Sinistra said. In the formal address. The respectful register. The one you use for elders. She looked at Harry too. He didn't learn that. He just knew it. They stood there together for a moment, watching Harry Potter thank the oldest snake in Britain for the patience she'd shown a dead woman's son. Then Amelia went to write up the arrest report for Peter Pettigrew, and the formal application for Sirius Black's emergency Wisengamot review, and the request for Remus Lupin's current address from the Department of Records, and all the other things that needed doing before tomorrow, which was going to be at least as complicated as today. The atrium was warm with the quiet of its assembled snakes and the sound of a small boy speaking an ancient language, and the case that had started 2 nights ago with a child's dream continued to pull on every thread that had been left loose in the fabric of wizarding history, and the threads kept coming. Chapter 6. What the Snakes Remembered. Remus Lupin arrived at the ministry on a Wednesday morning looking like a man who had been existing rather than living. He was 35 years old and looked 10 years older than that, which was the result of several compounding factors, the lycanthropy, which left its marks in the gray streaks at his temples and the way he moved as though his body remembered pain as its default state, the war, which had taken most of the people he loved in a single year, and the last 4 years, which had been the specific extended misery of someone who had survived something and couldn't quite justify the survival to themselves. His robes were clean but worn at the elbows, and he had the particular careful neatness of someone with very little money who refused to be untidy about it. He came in through the visitor entrance, through the phone box, and stepped into the atrium and stopped. The snakes were still there. 6 days after they'd arrived, the ministry had quietly stopped trying to disperse them and started working around them, which was the pragmatic accommodation of a bureaucracy that had realized the snakes were going nowhere until they chose to go, and that the investigation they'd facilitated was still actively using their testimony. Most of the ministry staff had achieved a working equanimity with them. The snakes, for their part, seemed to have achieved a working equanimity with being in a government building, which perhaps said something about their patience. Remus looked at them, and then past them, to the small dark-haired figure in the center of the atrium floor. Harry was sitting cross-legged with his school exercise book open on his knee, doing sums. He had the pencil between his teeth and the particular frown of someone who was checking their own work, and the ancient adder was coiled beside him like a very attentive tutor. Remus stood very still. He was doing what Amelia had been afraid he'd do. She could see it happening across his face from across the room, the specific expression of a person applying blame like a poultice, positioning themselves at the center of causality when they were not the cause. He looked at Harry and he was already deciding things about what he should have done. She walked to meet him before he could complete the process. "Mr. Lupin," she said. "Thank you for coming." He looked at her with pale amber eyes that were exhausted and attentive in equal measure. "He looks like James," he said, without preamble. "He has his mother's eyes," she said. "He has James's, the way he's sitting. The way he holds his pencil." He stopped. Looked at Amelia. "You said he's all right." "He's better than all right," she said. "Come and meet him." Harry looked up when they were 10 feet away, which was his standard distance for noticing approach. He registered Remus with the quick assessment, and then the assessment slowed, the way it slowed when something required more than one pass. He looked at him with the particular focused attention he gave to things that were interesting in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Harry," Amelia said. "This is Remus Lupin. He was a friend of your parents." Harry looked at Remus. Remus looked at Harry. "You look terrible," Harry said. It was entirely without malice, pure observation delivered with the honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned the social architecture around certain truths. Remus blinked. Then something happened around the corners of his eyes that was not quite a smile but was working toward one. "You're right," he said. "I do." "Why?" Remus sat down on the floor without being invited to. He sat the way people sat when they decided to tell the truth rather than a version of it, cross-legged, at Harry's level, with his worn elbows on his knees. "I've been sad," he said. "For a long time. Your mum and dad died and I didn't handle it very well." Harry thought about this. He tapped the pencil against his exercise book twice, which Amelia had come to recognize as his thinking rhythm. "Did you know them well?" "They were my best friends," Remus said. "Along with Sirius. The four of us were at Hogwarts together." "Sirius Black," Harry said. He'd been briefed, carefully, about Sirius 2 days ago, the day after Amelia had visited Azkaban. He'd been told the full account, the wrongful imprisonment, the evidence, the trial that was being prepared, and had received it with the same quality of focused stillness with which he received everything that mattered. He'd asked 3 questions, all of them precise. Was he innocent? Is he hurt? When does he come out? He's in Azkaban, Harry said now. Yes, Remus said. He shouldn't be. No, Remus said. He shouldn't. His voice was level but there were edges in it, edges that had been there for 4 years with nothing to cut. I should have, there are things I should have done differently. When it all happened. I believed, he stopped. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made. Harry looked at him steadily. The Dementors are there, he said. At Azkaban. Professor Sinistra told me what they do. Do you know if he's all right? Amelia saw him 2 days ago, Remus said. He looked at Amelia. He's holding on, she said. Harry nodded. He went back to his exercise book for a moment, made a correction, then looked back up at Remus. Will you stay? He asked. It was very direct, without apology or performance. Not can you or maybe would you like to, just the clean question. Remus was quiet for a beat. If you'd like me to, he said. I would, Harry said. You knew them. I want to know things about them. Amelia knows some things, and the snakes know some things, but you knew them as people and that's different. He said it with the practical directness of someone who had identified a resource and was being efficient about it. Is that all right? Yes, Remus said. His voice was slightly unsteady on the single syllable, but he produced it. Yes, that's very all right. Harry looked at the exercise book, then at Remus again. Are you good at maths? Moderately. Can you check this? I think I've done it right but I keep getting a different answer on the last one. Remus took the exercise book. He looked at it for a moment. You have done it right, he said. All of them. The last one is correct. I thought so, Harry said, with satisfaction. He took it back. Then he looked at the ancient adder. This is Remus, he said, in Parseltongue. He knew my mother. The old snake regarded Remus with her amber gold eyes. She said something brief. Harry looked at Remus. She says she remembers you. You came to the cottage once in the summer, before the end. You sat in the garden and you were reading, and she came to look at your book and you weren't frightened of her. Remus looked at the ancient adder. His jaw was doing the thing jaws did when someone was managing them carefully. I remember that, he said. His voice came from somewhere very quiet. I remember that exactly. 3 days later, on a Saturday, Sinistra came to find Amelia at 7 in the morning. She knocked twice on the conference room door and came in already talking, which was not her style, and told Amelia the talking couldn't wait. She had a sheaf of transcriptions under one arm and her reading glasses on her face this time. She'd graduated from head to face 2 days ago, which Amelia had noticed and taken as a sign that things were intensifying. "The old adder," she said. "She asked to speak to me last night. Not to Harry, to me, directly." She distinguished very deliberately between the two kinds of communication, the kind she was having with Harry and the kind she wanted to have with a translator, and she made clear she wanted this one documented formally and not relayed through Harry first. She set the transcriptions on the table. "I think she's been working up to this. I think she's been giving Harry everything else first because she wanted him to have it, and this she wanted to go directly to us." Amelia looked at the transcriptions. "What is it?" "The night of October 31st, 1981, Sinistra said. She gave me her full account. Not the summary she gave us in the first session, the full account. Every detail she's been holding for 4 years. She sat down across from Amelia. I want to walk you through it. Some of it you'll know from what she told Harry, from what's in the corroborating accounts. But there are things in here that aren't in any of the other testimony. Things that change the picture significantly." Amelia turned to the first page. Sinistra walked her through it methodically, the way she'd structured the full translation, chronological, precise, with her annotations in the margins, and her translator's notes where the serpent language used concepts that required explication. The old snake had been in the garden that evening, as she'd said. She'd seen the Potters, Lily at the kitchen window washing up, James outside briefly in the late afternoon before the weather turned. She'd seen the argument between Sirius and Pettigrew, corroborating the earlier account in every particular. Then she'd gone under the rockery for the night, which was her habit. She'd been there when the visitor arrived. She says he arrived silently, Sinistra said. No apparition crack. No sound at all. She felt him before she heard him, a cold. She describes it as a cold that wasn't weather, a cold that was intentional, the cold of something that had chosen to be cold rather than happened to be. She glanced at Amelia. She came out from under the rockery. She says she was compelled to watch, the way snakes were sometimes compelled to watch things that were significant. She uses the word that means, roughly, a moment the earth needs recorded. She describes having the sense that she was there because she was supposed to be there. Amelia was reading the text. Her pen was still. She saw him enter the house, Sinistra said. She was under the kitchen windowsill by then. She heard Lily, and she describes what he said, and I've translated it as literally as I can, but you should understand that serpent recall of human speech is phonetically accurate rather than conceptually. They remember sound, not meaning. She heard the sounds and she's reproduced them. She pointed to a section midway down the page. Amelia read it. She heard James, Sinistra said. And she heard Lily. And she describes the sounds Lily made in the last moments as, Sinistra stopped. She took a breath. She was a professional and she had been doing this for 30 years and she took a breath. She describes them as the sounds of someone who was still arguing. Still trying. Not giving up. Amelia read Lily Potter's last conversation with the man who killed her, reconstructed from the phonetic memory of a snake who had pressed herself against the cold wall beneath a kitchen window and recorded it, and she read it with the complete stillness of someone who was not going to show the effect of it in this room, not yet, not while there was still work to do. She turned the page. This is where it changes, Sinistra said. Her voice was careful now, the way it was careful when she was delivering something she'd been deciding how to deliver. After the lights. After the sound stopped. She says there was a pause, a significant pause. She's specific about the duration. She estimates several minutes based on how far the moon had moved, and then something happened in the house that she doesn't have language for. She describes it as, Sinistra looked at the transcription. I'm going to read this directly, a sound that was not sound. A light that was not light. The cold thing had ended and something else was there, something that was not a cold thing, something that was, looking at the small one. I do not have words for what it was doing. It was deciding. And then she says, and it did not stay. Amelia looked up from the page. It did not stay, she repeated. Whatever Voldemort became in that moment, whatever the killing curse did to him, or didn't do to him, the old snake witnessed it. She saw it make a decision. And she says it looked at Harry, and it left. Sinistra spread her hands. She has held this for 4 years. She's never been in a position to tell anyone who could do anything with it, until now. The room was quiet. He's not gone, Amelia said. Not a question. She doesn't know what he is, Sinistra said carefully. She only knows what she saw. And what she saw was something that was, she uses the word for suspended, actually. Not ended. Suspended. She looked at Amelia steadily. I know what this means for the investigation. I know it goes beyond the scope of what we're currently. It doesn't go beyond the scope, Amelia said. It goes to the heart of it. If Voldemort isn't gone, if he's in some form, then the question of Harry Potter's protection, of where he lives and how he's guarded, is not just a welfare question. It's a strategic one. She picked up her pen. And everyone who made decisions about that protection needs to answer for those decisions in full light of this. She wrote quickly. Dumbledore's Veritaserum statement is tomorrow. This goes into that session. He'll know, Sinistra said. Dumbledore will know what the snake saw. He was there too, that night. He knows what condition Voldemort left in. Yes, Amelia said. He does. She looked at Sinistra. Has Harry seen this part of the testimony? No. She gave it to me first, specifically. I think Sinistra paused, thinking about how to say it. I think she understands more about human politics than we give her credit for. I think she understood that this particular information needed to go to the person with the authority to act on it before it went to the child it concerns. Amelia nodded. She picked up the transcription and held it for a moment. For years in a garden in Godric's Hollow. For years of carrying this, waiting, pressed under the windowsill of a dead woman's empty house while the world moved on and made its mistakes. She's been remarkable, Amelia said. She's been patient, Sinistra said. There's a difference, I think, from her perspective. She would say she was just waiting for the right speaker. Harry had been exploring. This was partly because he was 4 years old and exploration was the appropriate response to any new environment, and partly because the Ministry of Magic was the most interesting place he had ever been, which was a low bar in terms of competition but a high bar in terms of reality. He had been into the lift 17 times. He had identified every gargoyle on the 3rd floor and given them names. He had discovered that the enchanted ceiling in the atrium could be communicated with if you stood in the exact center of it at noon and said something clearly upward, and it would show you weather, and he'd spent 20 minutes one afternoon requesting increasingly specific weather events to see what it could do. It could do most things. He was satisfied with this. Remus had been with him for 3 days, sleeping in the adjacent ministry guest room and accompanying Harry through his exploration with the expression of someone who had not expected to laugh this week and kept being ambushed by it. They had developed an arrangement. Harry asked questions and Remus answered them, all of them, without scaling them down to 4-year-old level, which was the thing Harry appreciated most. He had spent 4 years being told he was too young to understand things. Remus told him things. He'd heard about his parents in pieces, building the picture the way the water-stain map on the cupboard ceiling had built geography, not all at once, not from a central point outward, but accumulating detail, each piece adding depth to the ones before it. Remus told him about his mother's fury when things were unjust, the specific bright burning kind that other people called passion and Lily had called simple logic. He told him about his father's habit of ruffling his own hair when he was nervous or showing off, which were apparently not always distinguishable. He told him about the 4 of them at Hogwarts, for boys who had found each other in their first week and spent 7 years being simultaneously each other's best support and worst influence. He did not talk about Sirius without Harry initiating it, and when Harry initiated it he answered, and the answers were careful and honest, and Amelia, overhearing one of these conversations from the hallway, thought that Remus Lupin was doing the best thing a person in his position could do, which was being completely truthful about his own failures while refusing to make them the dominant story. On the Saturday morning, the morning Sinistra was with Amelia, Harry was in the atrium. Not with the ancient adder, who had been resting more in the last 2 days, conserving something that Harry had noticed and mentioned to Sinistra with a quiet thoughtfulness. He was with a group of the younger adders, and it was less formal, more playful, almost, in the way that serpent interaction could be playful, which was subtle but real. Remus was sitting on the floor nearby with a book, which was his version of supervision, present but unobtrusive, there when needed, otherwise giving space. He was reading but not reading, in the way of someone who was rebuilding their ability to be still in a world that had evidence in it. Harry came over and sat beside him. He leaned against Remus's arm with the casual ease of a child who had decided this person was safe and was communicating it in the direct physical language children used. Remus went very still for a moment, the way people went still when something they'd stopped expecting happened. Then he turned a page. "Remus," Harry said. The old snake. Something's changing with her." Remus looked down at him. "What do you mean?" Harry paused, choosing words with care, which he did when he was translating not just language but a quality of experience. "She's been carrying something for a long time. A very long time. And she's been giving it away. Bit by bit, to me, to Sinistra. Like she had a bag and she's been emptying it." He looked at the old adder, coiled under her light. "I think when it's empty she might be done." Remus was very quiet. "She's very old," Harry said. "I don't mind. She told me she doesn't mind either. She said," he shifted to the direct translation voice he used when quoting, "I have been the memory of this place long enough. Someone else will carry it now." He looked at Remus. "I think she means me." "I think she might," Remus said. "I'm all right with that," Harry said. He said it with the matter-of-factness of someone who had taken the measure of a thing and found it manageable. "She knew my mum. She was there. She's been keeping it for me until I was old enough to have it." He leaned into Remus's arm a little more. "That's the kind of thing that someone does when they love someone. Keeping things for them." Remus put his book down. He looked at the ancient adder. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Did you keep things?" Harry asked. A pause. "The kind that had weight." "I kept remembering," Remus said. "Even when it was hard. I kept making myself remember them exactly as they were, not as I wished they'd been or feared they'd been, but just, as they were." His voice was quiet. "I didn't know it was for you. But I think it was." Harry nodded, accepting this with the seriousness it deserved. "Remus," he said, after a moment. "Yes. You should eat more too," he said. "Your face looks like not enough food." Remus made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. It was rusty, short, clearly surprising to the person producing it, but it was a laugh, and Harry looked up at the sound of it with an expression of satisfaction, as if he'd fixed something. Dumbledore's Veritaserum session was on Sunday morning, at 9 o'clock as arranged. The room was prepared with the formal precision of a legal setting. The session would be witnessed by 2 members of the Wisengamot Oversight Board, plus Amelia, plus a ministry scribe. Dumbledore arrived exactly on time again, which was becoming its own kind of statement. He looked different this morning. Not diminished. Albus Dumbledore was not capable of appearing diminished in any straightforward way, but something in the performance had been set down. He came in without the full deployment of the magnificence, the way a musician sometimes walked onto a stage not as the performer but as the person. He was still tall, still silver-bearded, still wearing robes that cost more than most ministry salaries. But his eyes, behind the half-moon glasses, were something she hadn't seen in them before. Ready, she thought. He had decided to be ready for this. She administered the Veritaserum herself, 3 drops, properly witnessed, with the standard caution and the standard warning. He accepted it without comment. She asked her questions. He answered them. The session lasted 4 hours, and the transcript ran to 93 pages, and Amelia wrote specific sections of it out longhand later because she needed to have them in her own handwriting to make them fully real, and the substance of what Dumbledore said under Veritaserum did not contradict what he had said without it, which she had not entirely expected and which quietly rearranged some of her assessments. He had not known Pettigrew was alive. He had suspected the switch. The Veritaserum confirmed that he'd been less certain than he'd publicly appeared about who had been the secret keeper, had harbored doubts from the beginning that he had not acted on. The question of why he hadn't acted on them produced the most painful part of the session, the answer that came out in the flat, unadorned syntax that Veritaserum produced by stripping away everything except the unvarnished statement, because if Sirius was innocent, then I had left an innocent man in Azkaban and placed his godson in a neglectful household, and my judgment, which I have staked enormous things on, would have been catastrophically wrong, and I found the uncertainty preferable to the confirmation. He said this, and the room was very quiet. Amelia wrote it down. She asked about Voldemort. About what Dumbledore knew of his current state. The answer was long, technical, and in places deeply alarming. He had theories he had been developing quietly for years about the nature of the magical event at Godric's Hollow, theories involving soul magic, the most ancient and most dangerous category, theories about what a killing curse cast at a child protected by the magic of sacrificial love might do to the soul of the caster. He believed Voldemort was not dead. He believed he was fragmented, weakened, anchored to existence by magical means that Dumbledore had been investigating privately without telling anyone, because telling anyone would have confirmed that the war was not as over as everyone needed it to be. The old snake's testimony, something that was not cold, deciding, leaving, fit his theory precisely. He had known there was still a threat, and he had placed Harry Potter in the one location where the magical protection of Lily Potter's sacrifice was anchored, and he had not told anyone that this was a strategic decision as much as a welfare one, and the welfare had suffered for the strategy. When the session ended and the Veritaserum's effects cleared, Dumbledore sat for a moment with his hands on the table and his eyes open, looking at the transcript in front of him. I believed I was the right person to make these decisions, he said, in his own voice, unassisted by any potion. I believed that the weight of the decisions was mine to carry because I had the capacity to carry it. He paused. I did not consider that carrying a decision alone is not the same as making it correctly. No, Amelia said. It isn't. He looked at her. What happens now? The transcript goes to the Wisengamot Oversight Board, she said. There will be a formal review of your actions. It's unlikely to result in criminal charges. You acted in what you believed was the child's best interest, and the Veritaserum supports that belief was genuine. But there will be censure. And there will be requirements. She held his gaze. The involvement with Harry's care, going forward, will be supervised and structured. The era of unilateral decisions about his welfare is over. He nodded. He seemed, she thought, almost relieved, which was the response of a man who had been holding an enormous weight for a very long time and had, at some level, been waiting for permission to set it down. Can I see him? He asked. She considered. The welfare assessment was technically still active. The restriction she'd placed was technically still in effect. But Remus had been with Harry for 3 days and the world had not ended, and Harry was, by any measure, a person who was capable of managing his own interactions. I'll ask him, she said. She went and found Harry in the atrium and told him that Dumbledore was in the building and wanted to see him and that Harry could say yes or no and either answer was completely acceptable. Harry considered this with his pencil-tapping thinking rhythm. He's the one who put me at Privet Drive, he said. Yes. And he said he was doing it to protect me. That's what he said. That's what he believed. Harry was quiet. Did it work? The protection thing. As far as we can tell, Amelia said carefully, yes. The magical protection kept you safe from serious harm. The other harms were a different problem. He thought about this for a long time. The ancient adder was resting nearby, quieter today than she'd been. That emptying quality Sinistra had noticed too. "All right," Harry said. "He can come." Dumbledore came to the atrium and crouched down in front of Harry with the careful attention of someone who understood they were on probation, and Harry looked at him with those assessing green eyes, and said nothing at first, just looked. Then he said, "Why didn't you check?" Dumbledore looked at him. "I should have," he said. "I was wrong not to." "I'm not asking you to say sorry," Harry said. He wasn't cold, wasn't angry, he was simply precise. "I want to understand. Did you think they would be kind to me? Did you think they would be unkind and not care? Which was it?" It was, Amelia thought from across the room, one of the better questions she'd ever heard asked. She watched Dumbledore receive it, and she watched him make the decision not to soften it. "I told myself that safety and kindness were different things," Dumbledore said, "and that safety was sufficient. I knew Petunia would not be unkind in the way that would leave visible marks." He paused. "I told myself that was enough." It was not. Harry looked at him. "The snakes noticed," he said. "They noticed it wasn't enough. And they came here." He held Dumbledore's gaze. 647 snakes noticed something that you didn't. That's worth thinking about." "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. "It is." Harry nodded, and then, with the decisive simplicity of a child who had said what needed saying and was now ready to move forward, he held out his exercise book. "Can you check my maths? Remus checked it yesterday, but I want to see if you get the same answer." Dumbledore looked at the exercise book for a moment. Something moved across his face, something that had grief in it and relief in it and a quality of being undone in the very best way. He took the book. He looked at the sums. "You have it exactly right," he said. "I thought so," Harry said. Chapter 7, The Reckoning. The Wizengamot Chamber had not changed in 300 years, which was either a testament to the durability of its construction or a testament to the institution's relationship with change, and Amelia Bones had always suspected the latter. It was a circular room, tiered seating rising on all sides in dark wood, the kind of wood that had absorbed decades of argument and judgment and was now the specific shade of brown that meant serious business in the vocabulary of old British institutions. The ceiling was high and vaulted, and the light came from floating magical sources that had the quality of overcast afternoon even at 9 in the morning, which Amelia had always found either atmospherically appropriate or deeply inconvenient depending on whether she was presenting or defending. Today she was presenting. She had been preparing for this for 3 weeks, 3 weeks since Harry came to the ministry, 2.5 since Pettigrew's arrest, 2 since Dumbledore's Veritasrum session. In those 3 weeks she had built a case that was, by the standards of wizarding legal history, genuinely unprecedented: multiple defendants, multiple counts, evidence drawn from human testimony, physical documentation, and the formally transcribed accounts of 647 snakes. The case had been reviewed by 4 senior legal minds, 2 of whom had tried to tell her it was too complex to prosecute in a single proceeding, and both of whom she had sent away with a list of the relevant statutes and a look that discouraged further discussion. She was not prosecuting it in a single proceeding. She was presenting it in sequence: Vernon Dursley first, then the ministry officials who had failed in their procedural duties, then Pettigrew, then the review of Sirius Black's imprisonment. Dumbledore's censure hearing was scheduled separately and would proceed through the Wizengamot's Conduct Committee rather than the criminal courts. Fudge's conduct was under parallel review by the Oversight Board. Each proceeding would build on the last. Each defendant would watch the case that preceded theirs and understand exactly how much Amelia Bones knew before they were asked to account for themselves. This was deliberate. Edgar Tipton had described the overall strategy, privately, as elegant, which was the word he used for things that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Amelia had described it as thorough, which was the word she used for everything, because thoroughness was the foundation of justice in the same way that foundations were the foundation of buildings. Nobody talked about them unless they were missing. She stood at the presenting bench on the morning of Vernon Dursley's hearing and looked up at the assembled Wisengamot and felt, with the clarity of conviction that she trusted in herself above all other intuitions, that this was going to hold. Vernon Dursley had been brought to the ministry by a joint magical Muggle liaison team, which was a procedure that existed precisely for situations involving Muggle individuals who had committed offenses against wizarding persons or wizarding law. He'd been given a formal notice 3 days before the hearing, delivered by 2 members of Amelia's department who had gone to Privet Drive and given him a document that explained, in the carefully calibrated language the ministry used for Muggle engagement, exactly what was happening. He arrived in wizarding robes that didn't fit him because no one had arranged for him to wear anything else, and he looked furious in the way of a man who had decided that fury was the appropriate response to everything that was happening and was running low on alternatives. He sat in the defendant's chair, which was the centerpiece of the chamber floor, a solid wooden chair that had metal bindings at the armrests which activated only in cases of violent defendants, and which Vernon Dursley's solicitor had been assured would not activate unless he gave reason, and he looked around the chamber with the expression of someone who was absolutely committed to the position that this was happening to him rather than because of him. His Muggle solicitor sat beside him, deeply out of his depth, with the particular stillness of a legal professional who had accepted a brief without fully understanding its parameters and was now in a vaulted circular chamber full of witches and wizards, reassessing his career choices. Amelia presented the case. She had always believed that the presentation of evidence was its own form of advocacy, that a properly ordered case argued for itself, that the lawyer's job was clarity and sequence, not performance. She presented in the way she did everything, methodical, precise, without embellishment. The documents first. The timeline of Harry Potter's placement at Privet Drive, the 4 years without ministry inspection, the physical evidence catalogued by Petra Vance, photographs, the object inventory, the rope. She presented the healer's report from Marcus Webb, the nutritional findings, the old bruising noted on the forearm and shoulder. She presented the serpent testimony. The defense objected to the serpent testimony. This had been anticipated. Amelia had prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and she walked the Wisengamot through the Wizarding Evidence Act of 1943, Section 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph 2, which established the conditions under which magical creature testimony could be admitted, and she demonstrated that every condition was met. And she did this with the quiet patience of someone who had read the relevant legislation so many times it had become part of her internal structure. The Wisengamot deliberated on the admissibility question for 20 minutes. The testimony was admitted. Vernon Dursley's own account of events followed. His solicitor had coached him, Amelia could tell, he was less aggressively certain than the man she'd met in his sitting room, more managed, more careful. He talked about doing his best, about a difficult situation, about a child whose abnormalities, the word came out with a particular quality of emphasis that the Wisengamot heard the way she'd known they'd hear it, had been challenging for the household. He talked about firm parenting. He did not talk about the cupboard, and when he was asked about it directly by the chief warlock, he said that Harry had chosen to sleep there because he preferred it. The chief warlock looked at him over his spectacles and asked, specifically, how a child under 4 years old had chosen a sleeping arrangement in a cupboard with a lock on the outside. Vernon Dursley did not have a good answer for this. The hearing lasted 2 days. Petunia gave separate testimony, having accepted the offer of partial cooperation in exchange for the Wisengamot's consideration of mitigating circumstances. She was not spared difficulty, the questions were thorough and some of them were hard, but she answered all of them, and the account she gave was consistent with what she told Amelia at Privet Drive, and it was honest enough to be believed. The verdict on Vernon Dursley came back on the morning of the second day, guilty on 3 counts, including 1 count under the Wizarding Statute for neglect of a magical minor and 2 counts of physical harm. He was sentenced to a period of Muggle-appropriate community service overseen by the liaison team, a significant fine payable to a ministry-administered trust in Harry's name, and a formal prohibition on any contact with Harry Potter. His solicitor appealed on 3 grounds, lost on 2 of them, and conceded the third. Petunia received a conditional discharge with requirements, including cooperation with the ongoing investigation. She left the chamber without looking at Vernon and did not speak to him in the corridor outside. Harry was not in the chamber for any of this. He was in the ministry common room with Remus and a pile of books that Remus had brought from his flat, a mix of things, fiction and fact, the starting point of the education Remus had been quietly assembling since the second day. He knew the hearing was happening. He had declined to attend. "I don't need to watch it," he'd told Amelia, when she'd asked if he wanted to. "I know what happened. I was there." She'd nodded. "That's very sensible," she said. "I'd rather know what happens after," he said. "What's going to happen next?" She told him the schedule of the subsequent hearings. He listened to it in full. When she'd finished he said, "Serious. When is his?" "Week after next," she said. "If everything goes as I expect, he'll be home before the end of November." Harry nodded. Home, she could see him thinking. Home was a complicated word for both of them right now. The ministry officials came next. There were 4 of them, and the charges against them ranged in severity. One was charged with the specific offense of failing to process the child placement letter that had been sent to the minister's office on November 2, 1981, which under Section 9 of the Placement and Guardianship Act was a criminal offense when the failure resulted in harm to the child in question. 2 more were charged with failing to conduct mandatory welfare inspections over the 4-year period. The 4th, and most senior, was Bartemius Crouch Sr. Crouch was a different proposition from Vernon Dursley. He was not frightened of this room, he had presided over cases in this room, had sent men to Azkaban from this room, had built his considerable reputation in exactly this space. He sat in the defendant's chair with the specific manner of someone who had decided their dignity was not available for confiscation, and he watched Amelia present the case against him with the expression of a chess player watching an opponent set up an unexpected configuration. His offense was specific, the processing of Sirius Black's arrest without trial under emergency wartime powers at a time when those powers were, legally, still applicable. The war had not been officially declared over on November 2, 1981, technically not until December, but the application of those powers to Black's case had been, Amelia argued, a deliberate expedience rather than a genuine necessity. The evidence was in the timeline: Black arrested on the 2nd, the child placement letter processed on the same day and documented as sent, the trial process never initiated, the emergency powers paperwork filed with a speed that suggested the paperwork came before the decision rather than following it. Crouch argued jurisdiction. He argued the wartime powers were legitimately applied. He argued that the events of November 1st and 2nd had been chaotic and that decisions made in chaos should be assessed by the standards of chaos rather than the standards of calmer reflection. Amelia said, with respect, the ministry's procedural safeguards exist precisely because chaos produces bad decisions, and the procedural safeguards were not followed. She laid out the documentation. The child placement letter was generated at 9:43 in the morning. The arrest paperwork for Black was filed at 10:16. There is a 33-minute window in which both documents were being processed simultaneously in this department. The decision to skip Black's trial was made in that window, by someone who had the authority to waive the normal process, and the only person in this department with that authority in November 1981 was Bartemius Crouch Sr. Crouch looked at the documentation. He was very controlled, very precise. "I acted in what I believe to be the best interests of Wizarding security," he said. "You acted to close a complicated case quickly," Amelia said, "and the chamber was very quiet, because Peter Pettigrew was dead, apparently, and Sirius Black was in custody and emotional, and the official story was coherent and convenient and the alternative required more investigation than anyone had the appetite for in the immediate aftermath of the war's end." She looked at him steadily. An innocent man spent 4 years in Azkaban. A child spent 4 years in a Muggle cupboard. Those are the consequences of the convenient story. The deliberation on Crouch was longer and more contentious. He had defenders on the Wizengamot, men and women who had worked alongside him, who respected his record, who genuinely believed that wartime decisions should be judged by wartime standards. The debate went for a day and a half, and Amelia presented her closing argument with the composed certainty of someone who had built their case from the ground up and trusted the architecture. He was found guilty on 2 counts. The sentence was demotion and formal censure. He would not go to Azkaban, which Amelia had not expected and had not argued for, because the point was not punishment in the abstract but accountability in the specific, and a man like Crouch being publicly found guilty in the chamber where he'd sentenced others was, in its way, the most significant consequence he could face. He left the chamber with his dignity intact and his reputation permanently changed, and those two things sat in uncomfortable tension, and Amelia thought that was probably appropriate. Peter Pettigrew's hearing was on a Thursday. He had been in holding for 3 weeks, and the time had not improved him. He looked like a man who had been afraid for 4 years and was now afraid in a different way, with the fear of someone who had run out of the direction to run in. He had a ministry-appointed legal representative, a competent young witch named Clara Hoffman who had reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness the situation required and come to Amelia privately 3 days before the hearing to indicate that her client was considering a full cooperation agreement. Amelia had said she would consider it. The agreement was this: Pettigrew gave full testimony, under veritaserum, corroborating the serpent accounts and providing additional detail about the circumstances leading to the Potters' deaths and the events of November 1st. In exchange, the charge of direct causation in the Potters' murders, which Amelia had included in the charge sheet as a matter of legal accuracy, though conviction on that count would have been difficult, was reduced to the lesser charge of conspiracy to facilitate, with a reduced sentencing recommendation. He was still going to Azkaban. That was not the question. The question was how long. He gave his testimony on Thursday morning, in the veritaserum session that Amelia conducted in the chamber itself, with the full Wisengamot present, and it was the most unpleasant 2 hours of the entire proceeding. Not because Pettigrew was defiant, he wasn't, he was the opposite of defiant, he was the terrible spectacle of a man who had made choices he knew were wrong at every step and had chosen them anyway, and had continued choosing them for 12 years of rat-shaped hiding. He confirmed the secret keeper switch. He confirmed that he had been the one to tell Voldemort where the Potters were. He said, under Veritaserum's flat compulsion, that he had done it because he had been afraid of Voldemort and had believed Voldemort was going to win, and that he had thought that being on the winning side was worth more than his friends' lives, and that he had known, from the moment he heard that Voldemort had gone to Godric's Hollow, that he had killed them as surely as if he'd cast the curse himself. He said this. The Veritaserum said it through him, flat and undecorated. The chamber was very quiet. Amelia looked at the Wisengamot. She had one thing left to say, and she said it simply. Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 4 years and 3 weeks for a crime that Peter Pettigrew has now confirmed, under Veritaserum, in full Wisengamot session, that he committed. I ask the court to note this in the formal record of today's proceedings, and to carry that notation into the review of Mr. Black's case, which will be heard in this chamber Monday next. The notation was carried. Pettigrew was sentenced to 12 years. He went without drama, which was the least satisfying version of justice but also, Amelia thought, the most honest. The world didn't always provide satisfying endings to these things, and pretending otherwise was its own form of dishonesty. Harry was in his usual place when Amelia came back from the Pettigrew hearing. Remus was with him, as he had been every day. They were on the ministry common room floor with a large piece of parchment between them on which Harry was drawing something, a map, it looked like, of a place that didn't exist yet in his experience but that he was building with the precision of someone who had spent years with a water-stained map on a ceiling and knew what it meant to want geography. He looked up when Amelia came in, and he read her face with the quick accuracy that still caught her off guard sometimes. Done, he said. Done, she said. She sat in the nearest armchair. Monday is serious. Harry put down his pencil. He looked at the map for a moment, at the place he'd been building. When they let him out, he said slowly, where does he go? That depends on the outcome of the hearing, Amelia said. If it's acquittal, which is what we're expecting, then the practical question is living arrangements. He'll need a home, a proper one. He'll need time to recover. He'll need support. Harry thought about this. Could he live with me? He asked. The question landed in the room with quiet significance. Amelia looked at Remus, who was looking at Harry with an expression that was very soft. That's something we'd need to arrange officially, she said carefully. He'd need to be assessed as a guardian, go through the proper channels, but it could happen, Harry said. Not asking for a promise. Just asking for the truth of the possibility. Yes, she said. It could happen. He nodded, and went back to his map, and drew a door in the building he was making, and Amelia watched him do it and said nothing, because some things didn't need words. Snape came on Saturday. This had not been Amelia's idea. It had been the Wisengamot Oversight Board's. They had been systematically calling in everyone tangentially connected to the events of 1981 and its aftermath, building the fullest possible picture, and Severus Snape's name had appeared in the correspondence files because he had been Lily Potter's childhood friend, because he had turned informant to Dumbledore during the war, and because his testimony could corroborate specific elements of the timeline around the Potters' deaths. He came in like a winter afternoon, dark and cold, with the particular manner of someone who had spent years using discomfort as a perimeter. He was 25 years old, which was younger than he looked. His face had the quality of something that had been weathered fast, all the ordinary softness of youth burned off by the war and whatever had come after it. He was a Hogwarts professor now, had been for 4 years, had come directly from the castle with ink on his fingers and the expression of a man who had received a ministry summons and spent the journey deciding how to manage the interaction. He looked at Amelia. He looked at the conference room. He looked at the pile of documents and his jaw did something controlled. Mr. Snape, Amelia said. Thank you for coming. Professor, he said. Automatic, not aggressive. Professor Snape. She gestured at the chair across from her. Sit down. He sat. He was very still, in the manner of someone who had decided stillness was strategic. I understand you need corroborating testimony about the events of October 1981, he said. I'll give you what I can. I appreciate that, she said. Before we get to the formal questions, I want to be transparent with you about what we have, so you understand the context you're speaking into. She opened the relevant section of her case file. We have Dumbledore's Veritaserum testimony. We have serpent testimony from Godric's Hollow. We have Pettigrew's confirmed account of the secret keeper switch. We have documentation of the protection arrangement at Privet Drive. She paused. We have a great deal, Professor. What I want from you is the texture. The things that don't show up in documents. He looked at her. What things specifically? You were Lily Evans's friend, she said. Not unkindly, not gently, just directly, the way she was direct with everyone. Before the war, and during it. You were the one who went to Dumbledore when you heard the prophecy. That decision, she held his gaze, that decision to turn informant, to warn the Potters. Tell me about it. His face did something that he controlled, but she was watching too closely for the control to be complete. I've given testimony about this before, he said. The Death Eater trials, I've read those testimonies, she said. They're formal and precise and they tell me what you did. I want to know what you knew. She paused. Specifically, when you heard the prophecy and understood who it referred to, and you went to Dumbledore and warned him, did you know it was already too late? Did you know Voldemort already had the information? He was very still. I suspected, he said at last. And you went anyway? Yes. Why? A long pause. He looked at the table. When he spoke, his voice had the specific flatness of something that was true and private and was being said out loud for the first time. Because Lily was, because the Potters needed to be warned, regardless of whether the warning would help. He looked up. That's all. She held his gaze. And after, she said. After they died. You knew Harry had survived. You knew where he was placed, Dumbledore told you, eventually. Eventually, Snape confirmed. And you knew about the placement. The Muggle household. You knew what Petunia was like, presumably, you'd met her, as Lily's childhood friend. He was very quiet. Professor Snape, Amelia said. I'm not asking if you had a legal obligation to report what you knew. I'm asking what you knew and what you chose to do with it. His jaw was tight. I knew he was alive, he said carefully. I knew where he was. I knew the household was, he paused. I did not inquire further. I told myself it was not my concern. He was Lily's son, and he stopped. And he was James Potter's son, Amelia said. The room was absolutely still. Yes, Snape said. Flat, honest, the truth with all the flesh stripped off it. And the combination of those two facts made me. He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer, and when he came back from it his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something rougher and more exposed. I made it not my concern. Deliberately. He looked at her. That was a choice. It was the wrong choice. She wrote it down. She felt no satisfaction in it. She'd passed the stage where she felt satisfaction in people acknowledging their failures, had learned long ago that acknowledgement and change were different things and that the first didn't guarantee the second. But she wrote it down because it was true and it was relevant and it belonged in the record. I'd like you to see something, she said. She didn't give him a document this time. She stood up and said, "Come with me." She took him to the common room doorway and let him look in. Harry was on the floor with his map. Remus was beside him, pointing at something on the parchment and talking, and Harry was listening with that particular focused attention of his, and then he said something that made Remus laugh, the real laugh, the one that had been coming more often over the last week, getting less rusty with each repetition. Harry looked pleased with this in the specific way he looked pleased when he'd fixed something. Snape stood in the doorway and looked at the boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's hair and a quality of presence that was entirely his own, and his face did a series of things that Amelia did not catalogue because some things were private even in a ministry investigation. After a moment she said, quietly, "He's remarkable." "Yes," Snape said. His voice had a different quality to it. Not soft, exactly, softness was not the word for Severus Snape, but different. "He looks like," he didn't finish it. "Both of them," Amelia said. "He looks like both of them." Harry looked up then, as he always did when someone appeared in a doorway, his peripheral awareness registering the presence. He looked at Snape with the assessment, the two-pass assessment that meant something was requiring more thought. Then he looked at Amelia. "Who's that?" he asked. "His name is Severus Snape," she said. "He's a professor at Hogwarts. He knew your mother when they were children." Harry looked at Snape again. "Did you like her?" he asked. Snape was quiet for a moment. "Very much," he said. Harry looked at him for another beat, and then he said, "Do you want to see my map? I'm building a house." Something in Snape's expression, Amelia caught it, just at the edge, just for a moment, something that was not quite grief and not quite relief and not quite hope, but all three of them in some proportion she couldn't name. He moved into the room and sat down on the floor next to Harry, awkward, self-conscious, completely out of his element, and looked at the map. "What kind of house?" he said. "A big one," Harry said. "With a garden. And a room for Sirius." He pointed at the drawing. "That's the bedroom. I made it face east so there's morning light. Sirius has been somewhere very dark for a long time. I thought morning light would be good." Snape looked at the drawing. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have thought of that too." Harry looked up at him, and his expression was the one Amelia knew now, not the assessing look, not the curious look, but the one he got when something landed somewhere deep and true. He held it for just a moment, and then he nodded, and went back to his map. The Monday hearing for Sirius Black was the shortest of the sequence. It was also the most crowded. The Wisengamot chamber had not been this full since the Death Eater trials, and there was a quality to the assembled crowd, journalists, ministry officials, members of the public who had queued from early morning for the public gallery, that was different from the controlled atmosphere of the preceding weeks. There was an edge to it, the specific edge of people who had been carrying a held breath for 4 years and were now assembled in a room where they might get to release it. Amelia presented the case in 2 hours. She had been preparing this particular presentation since the morning she'd visited Azkaban, and it was the leanest, most precisely constructed argument she had ever made, because it didn't need to be long. The evidence spoke. The Veritaserum transcript spoke. The serpent testimony spoke. Peter Pettigrew had spoken, under oath and potion, and what he'd said was unambiguous. She presented the timeline. She presented the December 1st, 1981 document, the one that should have initiated a trial and never had. She presented the serpent testimony from Godric's Hollow in full. She presented Pettigrew's confirmed testimony. She presented the arrest record and its procedural failures. She presented Dumbledore's Veritaserum account. Then she said, simply, Sirius Orion Black committed no crime on the night of November 1st, 1981, or on any subsequent date for which he was imprisoned. He was arrested without trial, held without trial, and imprisoned on the basis of a story that Peter Pettigrew has now confirmed was false in every particular. The wizarding justice system failed him completely, and I ask this court to correct that failure today. The deliberation took 45 minutes. The acquittal was unanimous. When the chief warlock announced it, the public gallery made a sound that wasn't quite speech but carried everything speech could have said and more. The journalists were writing before the announcement was technically finished. The chamber was loud in a way it hadn't been loud all week, a different kind of noise than the controlled formal sounds of the legal process, something more human, more animal, the sound of a thing that should have happened 4 years ago happening now. Amelia sat down. She put her pen in her pocket. She allowed herself, in the 30 seconds before the next item of business, to close her eyes and feel the case sit in its completed form, the shape of it, the thing she built. Then she opened her eyes and went on to the next thing. Sirius arrived at the ministry that afternoon. He had been processed out of Azkaban that morning. Amelia had sent Yates and Okafor, her 2 most dependable people, to handle the release, because she trusted them to do it with the right combination of efficiency and human dignity. He arrived by ministry transport, not Flo. He was not yet steady enough on his feet for Flo travel, the healers at St. Mungo's had said, after the preliminary examination they'd done at the prison before release. He needed food, rest, and careful management of the Dementor after effects, which could take months to fully resolve. He walked into the ministry under his own power. That had been the condition he'd stated. Apparently, he would accept a wheelchair if absolutely necessary, but he would rather not. He was thin in the way that went past thin, and pale in the way that meant prolonged light deprivation, and his hair was long and tangled, and he moved as though his body was reminding him with every step that it had been through something significant. But he walked in. Harry was in the atrium. Amelia had not arranged this. She had, in fact, been planning to have Harry in the common room for Sirius's arrival, giving them both the option of a private meeting rather than a public one. But Harry had been told this morning that the acquittal was through and that Sirius was coming, and he had gone to the atrium and sat down next to the ancient adder in the middle of the ministry floor, and when Amelia had suggested the common room he had looked at her with complete serenity and said, "I'll wait here." So she'd let him wait. Sirius came through the main entrance with Yates on one side and Okafor on the other and Remus, who had gone to meet him, slightly ahead, and he stopped when he came into the atrium, because the atrium still had its snakes, the number somewhat reduced now but still several hundred, and because in the center of them was a small dark-haired boy sitting cross-legged on the floor. Harry stood up. He stood up and he looked at Sirius across the length of the atrium with those green eyes, and Sirius looked back at him, and the two of them were still for a moment that the room seemed to hold its breath for. Then Harry walked across the atrium, through the snakes that parted for him without being asked, in a straight line to the man who was supposed to have been his family from the beginning, and he stopped in front of him and looked up. "You're very tall," Harry said. Sirius made a sound. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and it was entirely human, the sound of something that had been held in 4 years of cold and dark suddenly meeting warm air. He crouched down, unsteady. Okafor put a hand briefly to his elbow, and looked at Harry at eye level. You look like your mum, he said. His voice was wrecked, rough, the voice of someone who had been crying or not sleeping or both for 4 years and today was crying again for the first time for a different reason. And my dad, Harry said. People keep telling me. Yeah, Sirius said. Both of them. You're both of them. He looked at Harry's face with the specific focused attention of someone memorizing something they'd been afraid they'd never see. You're bigger than I expected. You were so small. I was a baby, Harry said, with reasonable logic. You were, Sirius said. You're not anymore. No, Harry agreed. He looked at Sirius for a moment. Then he said, I drew a room for you. In my map. It faces east. Sirius blinked. Why east? Morning light, Harry said. You've been somewhere dark. And Sirius Black, acquitted, for years wrongfully imprisoned, standing in the ministry atrium surrounded by snakes with the godson he'd been kept from since the child was 1 year old, bent his head and pressed his forehead briefly to Harry's and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, because some things were complete without words, because this moment had been 4 years overdue and had arrived at last and the shape of it was exactly right. The ancient adder watched from her coil beneath the light, amber gold eyes steady, carrying a dead woman's love for the last time, and the atrium was full of the quiet of things coming right. Chapter 8, Harry Potter, age 11. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock on the 1st of September, and Harry Potter was on it 20 minutes early. This was not because he was anxious. It was because Sirius had insisted on arriving early, on the grounds that he had spent 5 years recovering from Azkaban and was not going to spend the morning of Harry's first day at Hogwarts fighting through a crowd on a train platform, and Harry had agreed with this logic while also understanding that the real reason was that Sirius needed the extra time to manage himself, because Sirius's relationship with large crowds of people in enclosed spaces was still a work in progress and probably would be for a while yet, and Harry had never once pointed this out because it was obvious and pointing out obvious things about people's difficulties was not kind. They'd been on the platform at 10:40, which meant they'd beaten the crowd by a comfortable margin, and Harry had found a compartment, and Sirius had put his trunk up on the rack with the slightly over-thorough attention of a man occupying himself with a physical task. And Remus had handed Harry sandwiches wrapped in paper because he'd been making Harry sandwiches for 7 years and was apparently not going to stop on the basis of Harry going to school. I'll have meals at Hogwarts, Harry said. These are for the train, Remus said. It's a 4-hour journey. Yes, Remus said, and put 4 sandwiches in the bag, with an apple and 2 chocolate frogs, which was the combination of practical and indulgent that had characterized Remus's approach to most things over the last 7 years. Harry looked at them both. They were standing in the corridor outside his compartment, Sirius with his hands in his pockets, which was his standing still posture, the one that meant he was managing something internally and presenting calm externally, and Remus leaning against the compartment doorframe with his arms crossed and his expression of careful not showing it that Harry had learned to read as well as he read anything. I'm going to be fine, Harry said. We know, said Remus. You both look like you don't think I'm going to be fine. We know you're going to be fine, Sirius said. We're going to miss you. That's all. Harry considered this. He looked at Sirius, who had put 5 years of genuine work into becoming a functional human being after Azkaban and who had also, in those same 5 years, become the kind of guardian that Harry had no useful reference point for at 4 years old but had been quietly building a definition of ever since. He looked at Remus, who had given him 7 years of sandwiches and answered every question he'd ever asked and turned up to every school event in worn robes that he'd quietly had repaired and was deeply pretending were new. All right, Harry said. Every week, Sirius said. Not a request. Every week, Harry agreed. He paused. Every week that something happens worth writing about. Everything is worth writing about. I'll use my judgment, Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a moment, and then his face did the thing it sometimes did, the involuntary thing, where the joy of the present moment ambushed the residual grief of everything before it and the result was something that was both at once. He pulled Harry into a hug that was slightly too tight for slightly too long, and Harry let it happen because he understood what it was for and because he didn't mind, and because Sirius's hugs had been one of the defining features of the last 5 years and the Hogwarts Express was not going to change that. "Go," Remus said, when Sirius released him. "Go before the crowd arrives and we're all crushed." Harry went. He sat in his compartment with his sandwiches and his bag and his trunk up on the rack, proper trunk, good quality. Sirius had bought it and Harry had argued about the price and Sirius had ignored the argument entirely on the grounds that buying Harry a proper Hogwarts trunk was not something he was prepared to compromise on, and he looked out the window at platform 9 3/4 filling up around him and felt the particular quality of the day settle. The ancient adder had died in December, 2 months after Sirius's acquittal. She had simply stopped one morning, curled in the spot she'd occupied for 3 months, the one beneath the central light of the Ministry atrium, and when Harry had come down and found her still, he had sat beside her for a long time and spoken to her in Parseltongue, the old formal register, the respectful address for elders, and he had said thank you, and he had said she had done more than anyone could have asked, and he had said that the things she'd carried were safe now. They had buried her in the garden at Grimmauld Place, which was where Harry and Sirius had been living since January, once the house had been cleaned out and warded and made habitable, which had been a significant project that Remus and Sirius had managed with the competitive stubbornness of 2 people who both needed to be useful. Harry had helped. He had opinions about furniture. The other snakes had left the Ministry in 1s and 2s over the months after the trials, returning to their dens and gardens and shops with the calm purposefulness with which they'd arrived. The atrium had gone back to looking like an atrium. Somebody had cleaned the floor where the snake testimony sessions had taken place, though Sinistra had told Harry privately that the marble in that section had a faint warmth to it now that it hadn't had before, the residue of several hundred hours of serpent presence, and that it probably always would. Sinistra had written a book. It was called Testimony of the True Tongue, Serpent Evidence and the Potter Investigation, and it was 160,000 words long and included 3 chapters of legal analysis and a full appendix of translated testimony. It had not been published yet, it was going through the Ministry's legal review process, which was slow, but Sinistra had sent Harry the manuscript, and he'd read all of it except the 3 chapters of legal analysis, which were interesting but dense, and he'd read those at half speed. He'd written her a letter about it. She'd written back 12 pages. He heard the compartment door and looked up. A girl stood in the doorway, brown-haired, slightly out of breath, with the particular expression of someone who had been methodically checking compartments and had finally found a suitable candidate. She was carrying a large book under one arm. Harry registered the title, Hogwarts, A History, which he'd already read twice, and a cat was attempting to escape from under her other arm. "Is anyone sitting here?" she said. "No," Harry said. She came in and settled the cat, who was orange and large and was regarding Harry with the professional suspicion of a creature that reserved judgment on new people until further data was available. She tucked herself into the seat across from him, opened her book, then immediately looked up, which was the move of someone who had intended to read and discovered they were actually curious about the other person in the room. "Hermione Granger," she said, as though they were exchanging credentials. "Harry Potter," he said. She looked at him. He was accustomed to this, not the fame look, the one that most people gave him, the one that tracked to his forehead looking for the scar and then adjusted all further interaction based on finding it. This was something more specific, a recalibrating look, the look of someone who had information that was being reconciled with the person in front of them. "I know who you are," she said. "Most people do," he said, without particular feeling about it. "I've read about the investigation," she said. "The serpent testimony case. My parents are Muggles, but I found Sinistra's preliminary papers in the Hogwarts library. Once I got my letter, I went 3 times before term started, and they were extraordinary. The legal framework alone, the way she established admissibility under the 1943 Act, I thought it was," she stopped herself, as if she'd just noticed she was talking fast. "Sorry." "Don't be," Harry said. "What did you think of the admissibility argument?" She stared at him. Then she unclosed the book she'd just opened and leaned forward. "I thought it was airtight," she said. The defense challenge was obvious, but Bones had preempted every angle. Did you know she prepared 14 separate counterarguments for the admissibility challenge? 14. She told me 15, Harry said. She said the 15th was a contingency she didn't end up needing. Hermione stared at him harder. You know Amelia Bones. She got me out of a cupboard, Harry said simply. We've stayed in touch. The compartment door opened again. A boy fell in, not quite fell, but arrived with the particular lack of physical composure of someone who had been running along a moving train corridor and had not entirely stopped before opening the door. He was red-haired and freckled and tall for his age, and he looked at Harry and then at Hermione and then at the cat, which had resumed its suspicious inspection of everyone present. Sorry, he said. Everywhere else is full. Can I? Yes, Harry said. Cheers. He dropped into the seat beside Harry and looked at the cat. That's a large cat. His name is Crookshanks, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who was used to people commenting on Crookshanks's size and had moved to preemptive information as a strategy. Ron Weasley, the boy said, to the compartment generally. Harry Potter. Ron looked at him. And this was the Fame look, or it started as the Fame look, but it shifted almost immediately into something else, because Ron Weasley had been 5 years old when a ministry official had come to his kitchen and turned his rat into a man, and he had a different relationship with the name Harry Potter than most 11-year-olds did. His ears went slightly red. Right, he said. Yeah. My mum talks about you. Not about you, about the investigation and everything. Scabbers was, he stopped. Sorry, that's a weird way to start. My rat was Peter Pettigrew, Harry said, with the ease of someone who had been answering questions about this for 5 years. It's all right. Not your fault. I know, but still, Ron said. He looked like he was working something out. Does it bother you? That we had him, all that time? No, Harry said. You didn't know. Nobody knew. That was the point of him. He looked at Ron steadily. And your family found him. Indirectly. Which helped. Ron absorbed this. The red at his ears receded slightly. My mum cried at the acquittal, he said. When it was on the wireless. She cried for about an hour and then she made a roast, which is what she does when she has a lot of feelings. A roast seems like a good response, Harry said. It was excellent, Ron agreed. Hermione had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone cataloging social dynamics in real time. You're both starting Hogwarts today, she said. First years. Obviously, Ron said. We're on the Hogwarts Express. I'm just establishing the common ground, Hermione said. She said it with perfect composure, the composure of someone who had decided they were correct and wasn't particularly bothered by other people's reaction to this. Harry liked it immediately. Crookshanks left Hermione's lap and walked across the seat to Harry and sat down on him, which was a significant departure from his earlier suspicious attitude and suggested that whatever standard Crookshanks applied to new people, Harry had met it. Harry looked down at him and then scratched behind his ears, and Crookshanks arranged himself with enormous satisfaction. He never does that, Hermione said, with genuine surprise. I'm good with animals, Harry said. The train moved through England and the sandwiches were eaten and the chocolate frogs were caught with varying levels of success. Ron caught both of his, Harry caught one and let the other go, and Hermione declined on the grounds that she'd read about them and was satisfied by the information, which she delivered without any awareness that this was an unusual response to chocolate frogs, and the compartment took on the quality of a space that had been occupied long enough to become comfortable. Harry looked out the window as the city gave way to countryside and thought about the last 7 years in the way he occasionally thought about them, not as a series of things that had happened to him but as a landscape he'd crossed and was now standing at a different elevation of, able to see the whole shape of it. The cupboard, the rockery, the dream. The snakes moving through the dark across Britain. The atrium, the brown furniture, the first sight of the Thames. Amelia at the garden bench saying someone made a mistake and I'm here to fix it. He thought about what fixing it had actually looked like, which was not one dramatic moment but a sequence of them, each one built on the last. Vernon in the Wisengamot chamber. Pettigrew on the Burrow kitchen table. Sirius standing in the atrium doorway, thin and pale, looking across the floor at a small person who'd been building him a room in a map. He thought about the ancient adder, who had waited 30 years and had given him everything she'd been keeping and had then decided she was done, and had been buried in the garden at Grimmauld Place under the apple tree, because Harry had chosen the spot. He thought about Dumbledore, who had been censured and who had accepted it, and who had been visiting Grimmauld Place for tea once a month since March, and who sat in Sirius's kitchen and drank tea and asked Harry questions about what he was reading, and had never once tried to manage him, which was either growth or the particular caution of a man who had been watching to see how Harry chose to be and had found, Amelia had suggested once, that the answer was not what he'd expected and was considerably better. Harry had asked Amelia what she meant by that. She'd said, he thought you'd be defined by the prophecy. By Voldemort. By the shape of what happened to you. He expected you to be a product of it. And instead? Harry had asked. Instead, she'd said, you're just you. And that's apparently more alarming to people than any prophecy would have been. He hadn't been sure if that was a compliment. She'd said it was. The countryside outside the window was going north and the clouds had the purple-gray quality of late afternoon and the train was running through hills now, the start of the really old landscape, the kind that had always been there in some form, and Harry watched it with the particular contentment of someone who had spent 7 years learning that the world was larger than a cupboard and had never stopped finding that fact satisfying. You know, Ron said, from his corner, where he'd been quiet for a while in the companionable way of someone who was comfortable with quiet, George and Fred said you could just ask the Sorting Hat where you want to go. That it listens. I read that too, Hermione said. There's a whole chapter in Hogwarts, a history on the Hat's decision-making process. The consensus in the academic literature is that it weighs the student's inherent characteristics against their expressed preferences when those preferences are, I know what I want, Harry said. They both looked at him. Gryffindor? Ron asked, with the hopeful tone of someone from an entirely Gryffindor family. Yes, Harry said. My parents were Gryffindors. Sirius was. Remus was. He paused. But not just that. I've read the accounts of all 4 houses. Gryffindor is where people go who act before they've worked out all the angles. He considered this. That's accurate. You seem like someone who works out all the angles, Hermione observed. I work out the angles and then I act, Harry said. That's the difference. Ron looked at him. Is that different? Yes, Harry said. Significantly. The Great Hall, when they reached it, was everything the book said it was and still managed to be more. Harry had read Hogwarts, a history twice, which meant he knew about the enchanted ceiling, about the 4 long tables, about the floating candles and the general dimensions of the space. Knowing about a thing and standing in it were different experiences, as he'd learned many times in the last 7 years, and he stood at the front of the first-year column and looked up at the enchanted October sky and felt the specific pleasure of having had a thing confirmed rather than undermined. He was aware of the hall becoming aware of him. He was accustomed to this, the way the information moved through a space, the specific shifting quality of attention when people recognized a name being embodied. The Hogwarts students were older than him on average, which meant they had been children of 7 or 8 when the investigations were ongoing, which meant most of them had no direct memory of the case itself but had grown up in the aftershape of it. The world the case had changed. They'd grown up knowing that Peter Pettigrew had been found in a rat cage. They'd grown up knowing that Sirius Black was innocent. They'd grown up knowing the name Harry Potter not as the boy who lived but as the boy who'd done it, who'd called Britain's snakes to the ministry in his sleep at 4 years old and started the dominoes falling. He didn't find this uncomfortable. He found it accurate. The sorting began. Names were called alphabetically, which meant the GS were several students in. Hermione walked up to the stool with the book still under her arm and the cat, Crookshanks was not supposed to be in the Great Hall but was somehow there anyway, in Hermione's arms, with the satisfied expression of a creature that had decided the rules did not apply to him, and the hat considered her for about 4 seconds before saying Gryffindor. Ron went, eventually, and the hat said Gryffindor before it was fully on his head, which made the whole Gryffindor table cheer and which made Ron's ears go red again in the way Harry was coming to think of as his default expression of strong feeling. Potter, Harry. The hall went very quiet. He walked to the stool and sat down and Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head and the brim came down over his eyes and the world went hat dark, and the hat said, in the specific interior voice of something that was speaking inside your skull rather than into your ears, "Well, I've been wondering when you'd get here." Harry thought, "Hello. You're not what I expected," the hat said. Not unkindly. With what might have been respect, in the way ancient magical objects expressed respect, which was more like recognition than admiration. "Most students your age come in here and I have to do some work to find the shape of them." "You're already a shape." "Am I?" Harry thought. "Quite a specific one," the hat said. "I won't ask which house, because you already know. You've known for some time. But I'll say this," it paused, in the way that ancient magical objects paused, "the students who already know are usually the most interesting ones. Not always the easiest, but the most interesting." "I'll take that," Harry thought. "You'll take most things," the hat said, and Harry thought it might have been amused. Gryffindor. The last word was said aloud, to the hall. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off, handed it back to McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression that was professional and also, he thought, trying not to be something warmer than professional, and walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down next to Ron and across from Hermione and Crookshanks, who was now inexplicably on the table, occupying territory. "I knew it," Ron said. "So did I," Harry said. The feast was excellent, which was expected. The hall was loud in the way that halls full of several hundred students were loud, and the volume was comfortable in the way that Harry had learned to find noise comfortable once the noise stopped being something to be afraid of. He ate with the unself-conscious appetite of someone for whom a good meal was still, 7 years later, something to appreciate rather than take for granted. He'd never quite lost that, and he didn't particularly want to. Across the table, a boy with a pale pointed face was looking at him. Harry had noticed him several times since the sorting, during it, specifically, when the hat had said Slytherin and the Slytherin table had politely applauded and the boy had sat down with the expression of someone who had expected the outcome and found confirmation of expectations more satisfying than surprises. He was a Malfoy. Harry had learned enough from Sirius about the major wizarding families to recognize the coloring, the manner, the particular quality of composure that came from a certain kind of upbringing. Sirius had grown up with the Malfoys as family friends and had opinions about them that he expressed with considerable color. Draco Malfoy was looking at Harry with the expression of someone who had made calculations about this moment and was now in the process of executing them. He came around the table during a lull between courses, which was a confident move, coming to Harry rather than waiting, which meant he'd decided on the approach of equality or near equality rather than the approach of supplication or the approach of superiority. Harry read all 3 options in the moment before Malfoy stopped in front of him. "Potter," Malfoy said. "Malfoy," Harry said. A slight adjustment around Malfoy's eyes. He'd expected to be recognized, probably, but perhaps not immediately and certainly by name. "Draco," he said. "You've heard of my family." "I've heard of most of the major wizarding families," Harry said. "Your father was a Death Eater who claimed the Imperius Curse. My godfather's brother served Voldemort before he died. Your family was social friends with the Blacks." He looked at Malfoy steadily. "I don't hold families against people individually. I form my own opinions." Draco Malfoy looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had prepared a speech and found that the speech was no longer relevant. He recalibrated quickly. Harry gave him credit for that, it was quick. "I've read about your case," he said. "The investigation. My father," a brief careful pause, "my father doesn't discuss it. But I read the public accounts. And? Harry said. It was impressive, Malfoy said. Precisely, not effusively. The word chosen with care. What Bones did. What started it? I was asleep, Harry said. I didn't know I was doing it. That's what makes it more impressive, Malfoy said, and there was a quality in his voice, not admiration exactly, something more complex, the voice of someone who had grown up in a house where power was discussed and measured and who was recalibrating their measurements in real time. You changed things. Everything since then, Pettigrew, Black, Crouch, Dumbledore, it all changed. Some things changed, Harry said. Some things are still being worked on. He looked at Malfoy. What are you proposing? Malfoy blinked. Sorry. You came over here with a purpose, Harry said. I'm asking what it is. Another recalibration. He was good at them, Harry thought, that was the Malfoy training, probably, the ability to adjust mid-current. To introduce myself, Malfoy said. And to say, he paused, choosing this carefully, that I'm not my father. Or at least I'm trying to work out whether I need to be. It was, Harry thought, a more honest thing than Draco Malfoy probably usually said to strangers. That's a worthwhile project, Harry said. Let me know how it goes. Malfoy looked at him for a moment, and then he went back to the Slytherin table, and Ron said, from Harry's left, what was that about? He's figuring himself out, Harry said. Aren't we all, Ron said, and then turned back to his roast chicken with the philosophical equanimity of someone for whom roast chicken was an adequate response to most existential situations. After the feast, after the Gryffindors had been led to the tower by Percy Weasley, who was a prefect and who had greeted his brother with the specific combination of warmth and official dignity that Percy apparently considered mandatory for the role, after Harry had seen his dormitory, which had 5 beds and 5 trunks and 5 sets of robes hanging from 5 separate wardrobes and was, by any measure, the most comfortable room he'd ever been assigned to sleep in, he went to the window. The window faced east. He hadn't known it would, hadn't chosen it, the dormitory beds were assigned and the window faced whatever direction it faced, which happened to be east. But it made him think of the map he'd made in the Ministry common room, the room he'd drawn for Sirius with the east-facing window, and the room Sirius had been sleeping in for most of a year now at Grimmauld Place, and the fact that Sirius had reported, in his first letter from that room, that the morning light was exactly as useful as Harry had predicted. He looked out at the Scottish night, the sky above the Hogwarts grounds going from black to very deep blue at the horizon, and he thought about what it meant to be here, not in the destiny sense, not in the prophecy sense, because he'd spent a long time being very clear with himself and with everyone around him that he was not the chosen one in any sense that required him to be chosen for things, that he was Harry and had always been Harry and the events of his life had been events of his life, rather than a narrative designed around him. But he was here. He was here because a 4-year-old had spoken in his sleep and 600 snakes had crossed Britain in the dark, and because a woman with a monocle had refused to go home, and because an ancient adder had waited 30 years at a dead woman's window with a government letter in her jaw, and because Remus Lupin had kept remembering even when it was hard, and because Sirius Black had held on to something in the cold that should have been impossible to hold on to and had been right to hold on to. He thought about all of them. He thought about the threads of a thing that had seemed broken and had been pulled into coherence not by one person but by several, not by a single decisive moment but by an accumulation of small ones, people choosing to look and to act and to refuse the convenient version of events. He thought about Amelia Bones, who had sent him a letter this morning. It had arrived at Grimmauld Place and Sirius had tucked it into his bag before they left, a short letter, not sentimental, which was her register, in which she said she expected to hear from him regularly about the defense against the dark arts curriculum because she was on the record as having concerns about it and was building a case for its reform and Harry's field observations would be useful. She'd also said, at the end, one sentence, "You're going to be absolutely fine." He believed her. He believed her not because she was authoritative, though she was, but because she'd been right about every important thing so far, and her track record warranted belief. The dormitory behind him had quieted. He could hear the even breathing of the other 4 boys in the room, Ron most recognizably, the deep uncomplicated sleep of someone who felt at home. He'd know the others by their names soon, by their habits, by the specific textures of their company. That was how it worked. People became known through proximity and time and the particular small evidence of how they were when nothing important was happening. He turned away from the window. He got into his bed, the one he'd chosen, the one on the left, which didn't face east but faced the door, which was the choice of someone who had spent enough years in a small dark space to want to know where the exits were and was gradually, through deliberate habit, learning to choose comfort over vigilance. He lay in the dark of the Hogwarts dormitory and thought about nothing in particular, just let the day move through him, the compartment, the ceiling, the hat's voice, the feast, the window, the east, and felt the particular quality of a thing beginning, the first night of the first day of a new chapter, which was not an ending but the opposite. He was 11 years old. He had already changed things. He was going to change more of them, not because a prophecy said so, not because the wizarding world had decided he was a symbol of something, but because he was Harry and Harry looked at things that were wrong and thought about what would fix them, had been doing that since before he could name the skill, would keep doing it the same way he'd always done it, methodically, directly, without apology or performance, because he was good at it and because it mattered. Somewhere in London, Sirius was probably not sleeping, which was still a common occurrence, which Harry was working on through the medium of chess problems sent by Owl because occupying Sirius's brain was better for him than letting it idle in the dark. Remus was probably reading, which was his resting state. Amelia was probably working. Sinistra was probably in the Hogwarts astronomy tower, which was where she went when she wanted to think. The snakes of Britain were in their dens, in their gardens, in their warm corners, going about the quiet patient business of being snakes, carrying what they carried, watching what they watched, waiting in the way that they waited with the long unrushed attention of creatures that measured time differently. And Harry Potter closed his eyes, and the Hogwarts night settled around him, and the scar on his forehead, the lightning bolt, the mark of everything that had started it and everything that had come after, caught the last of the moonlight from the window for a moment and then was simply part of his face, part of him, belonging to him and no one else. He was, as Amelia had said, going to be absolutely fine. Better than fine, actually. He was going to be extraordinary, which was not a thing that happened to him but a thing he was, had always been, from the first night in the dark when the words had come out of him in a language older than anyone in the house could name, and Britain's snakes had lifted their heads, and listened, and moved.